This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
And good afternoon, everyone. What a lively start to this committee. I did tell everyone right at the beginning of the municipal year, Planning Regeneration Committee is where we keep it exciting. So particularly excited to see a wonderful, packed audience today. So let me do the formalities. Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. I would like to extend a particular warm welcome to the students of the University of College who are studying urban planning, design and management along with their lecturers, Q waving at them. Who have come to listen to this meeting. I hope that you find the discussion interesting and useful, and that it's great to have you here, but also I'd welcome you to stick around afterwards. Hang out in the canteen. Feel free to grab any of the committee members if they have time. We'd love to hear your thoughts, if not after the meeting, but you'll be very welcome to follow up in email afterwards as well. You are the future generation of planning and regeneration in this city and beyond, so fantastic to be able to meet you here today. Now, please may I remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and ask the members and guests to ensure that their electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Today, we are holding an investigation on London and the 15-minute city. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have no apologies for absence.
Fantastic. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any interest to declare? Fantastic. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on 12th of September 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record? Agreed, except I think that might be a typo.
Yeah, 2022.
Yeah. Well, thank you for agreeing the minutes from a year ago. And equally, I would enjoy if you were able to confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 12th of September 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record. Thank you, committee. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the committee's previous meeting? I sort of heard a mumble of noted. Yeah, great. Great. So before we move on to our main item of business, a warm welcome as well to the new Deputy Chairman of the Committee, Peter Fortune, and great to have a full house, I guess, for the committee. So we have some really brilliant guests and experts joining us for today's discussion. We're very grateful in advance for your time. We have Catherine Gall, Executive Director from Chaire Entrepreneurship Territory Innovation, Jonathan Lloyd, Corporate Director of Strategy and Change for the London Borough of Waltham Forest, and Matthew McCartney, Senior Researcher for the Charter of Cities Institute. They're joining us here in person. Online, we have some guests and some who are joining us a little late. Currently, I think we have Enrica Papa, Associate Professor at the University of Westminster. At 2:15, Nicholas Boys, Director of Create Streets, will be joining us. And fantastic, we've now got Stephen Passmore as well, Head of Knowledge, Future of London. We were particularly impressed with your title, Stephen. Head of Knowledge means that we were going to ask you all sorts of questions, but we'll behave ourselves and restrict to the ones to do with this investigation. So I'm sure guests are aware that obviously we've got a wide-ranging list of questions, and we'll be going around and be sort of asking you them, and we'll have a break halfway through. I'll be starting us off, and I kind of almost wanted to give a maybe 1 or 2 line introduction actually before I got into the meat of the questions, or the tofu of the questions, if you like. And this is to sort of say what we were aspiring to do with this investigation, and if the committee will indulge me and allow me to speak on behalf of them, although feel free to correct me at any point. We held an investigation in September in 2022, and it was all about, how people's experience of their neighbourhood, their areas, living in London had changed during lockdown, and what that meant in terms of their expectations post-pandemic of their neighbourhood. How easy was it for them to build communal spaces with their neighbours? How easy was it for them to access local amenities when suddenly they were in lockdown? Did that change the expectations of what they wanted from their area? And it's sort of being percolating, I guess, in the committee's minds for a little while about how we might think about the redesign of London post-pandemic. So rather than this sort of being we're really excited or we're really cynical about the 15-minute concept, it's more of this was an established urban planning model that sort of exists, probably the most mainstream one that sort of seeks to maybe address some of those questions post-pandemic, even though it existed before that. So let's look at it and let's think about, are there parts of it that work? Are there parts of it that don't work? What could be improved? What should be left behind? So that's just sort of the small context I wanted to offer, and I appreciate the committee indulging me on that. So to that end, I'll sort of start with a slightly more broader question to our guests. And Catherine, I'll come to you first to answer it, if that's all right, and then anyone else to indicate if they're interested. Is, in your view, what type of urban planning policies would be required in order to improve the health and well-being of Londoners? And welcome.
Thank you for having me, and hello, everyone. I think it should start with actually involving people, because it's not a degree to get, or it's not a certificate to achieve. It's not a binary discussion to actually be oriented around 15 minutes or not. There are degrees of acceptance of how much and how far can you actually walk and cycle, because the whole point of this concept, which is a model we've been working on for a number of years. I'm coming in from Paris. We are a research team at La Sorbonne, and we've been looking at this first from a neutral perspective, reviving some of the other concepts that have preceded this one. This one was called 15 Minutes because it became viral as a name after the pandemic because of the lockdown everywhere, and people are rediscovering or discovering what was around their home, because our life are so polarized around leaving home in the morning to go to a place where we work and coming back in the evening and actually not being a full, maybe contributive inhabitant of a neighborhood. So the policy has to start with actually sort of defining a roadmap and agreeing on what are the things that we really need to access, what are the function, the services, the spaces that people need. And when we say people, we also have to study which types of people, because there is not a generic approach. It's what I need when I'm a mom and I have 2 young children that I need to maybe transport with a stroller or on a cargo bicycle or in my car. And it's a different approach when you are older, when you're a senior person, when you are someone with vulnerability in terms of mobility and so on. So there is all of this to be mapped out, to be understood, but certainly welcoming the idea of looking at walking, cycling, soft mobility as a primary mode of transportation would be great. But when you say that, you open the box to how do we achieve that? How do you redistribute and recreate nodes of services, and also the schools and the jobs and so on? So in terms of policy making, we've seen that in the city of Paris or other cities we are studying, there is certainly not a copy and paste approach. It's studying deeply the context, the specific, the attributes, but enabling people to have a voice, to actually express the things they need and how it can support their life with diversity and so on would be one.
Okay, that's fantastic, Catherine. Thank you. Did any of the other panelists wanted to answer that question specifically online or in person? Enrica, I see your hand's gone up. Let me know if you'd like me to repeat the question.
No, it's fine. I think just want to echo what was said. I would like to go maybe beyond the models and just looking at what people need, basically. I think, of course, having a model, a planning model might help. But I think it's really what is behind. So the idea, but again, the social question, community interaction is probably what is beyond the main idea, whatever we want to call it, 15-minute city or something different. Just a small comment. Just not to focus on
I appreciate comments, but obviously we'd be grateful if it was sort of a little bit more specifically responding to the question. So obviously we're intrigued, and if we wanted to improve the health and well-being of Londoners, what urban planning policy would be required to do so? So if you feel like the 15-minute city does that and you should go further, what aspects of that do you think meet the needs of improving people's well-being and health? So feel free to come in now or later.
I think the 15-minute city, I mean, there are evidences that might have impact on health well-being in terms of improve the quality and promotion active lifestyles well-being. So definitely, I think the 15-minute city, again, as a general idea, that means having as a goal accessibility and mobility as a mean, proximity as a mean, I think would definitely improve these 3 things mentioned in the question: health, well-being, and prosperity.
Okay, thank you. Matthew?
So I very much agree with the urban planner Alain Berthaud on this. I'm coming at this from, let's say, a fairly narrow economics angle. That's my background. So forgive me if I dwell less upon health, well-being, or define well-being in fairly narrow terms. So I agree with Alain Berthaud on this. That a good city, London, functions on the basis of 2 things: affordability and mobility. So mobility can, yes, be about 15 minutes walking and cycling. I think there are certain services, functions that are best done within 14 minutes of the home, like a supermarket, a pharmacy, primary schools, parks perhaps. More generally, mobility, Alan Berteau thinks of mobility in terms of a commute of up to an hour that constitutes no more than about 15% of a household's budget. Now, in survey, a little bit old, but a survey of 2013 showed that within a 45-minute commute, Londoners by public transport can access 54% of the city's jobs, which means mobility is functioning fairly successfully in London. In Nairobi, by contrast, 45 minutes by public transport, inhabitants could access 6% of the city's jobs. So very big differences in mobility. So Alan Berteau talked about cities in terms of them being a labour market, that firms need to be able to access a diverse range of employees, consumers need to be able to access retail, firms need to be to access their customers and suppliers. There needs to be interaction and learning. Second of those is affordability. That residents need to be able to live in houses that are close to something that are valued of schools or work. Firms need to be able to open near customers or suppliers. So good city works in terms of access and mobility, and sometimes that is about 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I would love to unpack the relationship between health and well-being and economic productivity, to be honest, which I'm sure we will do. But just to sort of return to the question specifically for any of the other panellists who wanted to contribute, is what type of urban planning policies would be required to improve the health and well-being of Londoners? And obviously we'll begin to unpack other layers of what is required. But maybe I'll move us on to the second part of this, and Catherine, we might bring you back in for this one, which obviously you spoke about Paris. Have such policies been implemented significantly in any other city? And if so, how successful have they been?
So we are seeing a number of other cities. So in Paris, this is an aspiration, something that has been embraced by the City of Paris for now 2 mandates. We are in the midst of the second mandate, so it's been a journey, and it is a journey. It's not something that you create like that, because you need alignment from many, many stakeholders. You need alignment from the city at city level, so mayors and sub-mayors. Today in Paris, the urban planning document is labeling the urban proximities. We're not speaking so much about 15 minutes because of the confusion around it's 15 and not 12 or 42. So it's called, the umbrella is called urban proximities, and the PLU in Paris actually has 2 components, bioclimatic construction and urban proximities. So in terms of examples of policy in Paris, but I can take others, one of the most scalable action has been to take back the streets leading to schools and to create pedestrianized streets with bringing back nature in it, but certainly slowing down traffic and actually blocking traffic, which means that number one, you allow kids and children to have a different relationship to the city environment if they can actually walk to school, which is something that happened, a long time ago, but for many, many reasons, with density in cities, with scale of cities, this wasn't so much the case, and not many families also take kids with metro and so on. So school street is one of the concepts. I don't have the exact number right now, but it's one of the measures that is being deployed, allowing children to go by themselves, encouraging the families to actually not take a car to drop the children, which means the second segment will probably not be done by car either. There is simply no place to park, so you have to organize yourself to actually walk your kids to school. I was around the school district yesterday afternoon, and with the weather we have right now, people were playing out, all generation, the ones who had been picking up the children staying because it's nice outdoor. Air quality is better, so to come back to the health question, in terms of physical health, of course, it's encouraging active mobility, walking, cycling, doing something with your body and not using an electric vehicle or another form of transportation. But it's also the quality of air. We survey that a lot. If you decrease the amount of cars, and any form of transportation, obviously the quality of air is better. In terms of health and policy, mental health and emotional health, which means you know the people around your corner, which has been the big discovery after the pandemic, because people were basically crossing each other in front of their apartment, but never engaging in doing anything. Now you see those communities, and actually it's part of also community development that can take place. So all of those things can be encouraged. So school streets are one of the biggest things. The second major change in Paris, if you have been there lately, is actually the number of bicycles and the bicycle path. I don't think anyone would have imagined taking a bicycle in Paris a few years ago. After COVID, it's several hundreds of kilometers of bicycle lanes. Taking the train this morning around Gall du Nord, I was blown away at 7 a.m. how many people were actually cycling in this big boulevard that is super busy, but it's a separated lane, so you have to create the infrastructure, and people start taking the shared bicycle, their own bicycle, whatever. So those are two of the main important dimensions of that project in Paris. We see them being replicated in other cities. This name, the school streets, is now becoming something that has been socialized, and people talk about it as one element that people recognize. Who wouldn't want the next generation to be able to be a walker in a city and not anymore a passenger of a vehicle of any type of sort?
Thank you, Catherine. And unless anyone were to offer specific examples of other cities or areas where this has happened, I might move us on to another question to wrap it in. Jonathan.
So from Waltham Forest perspective, it's more about, we see it as a kind of way of seeing and a way of working, and the starting point of that is ensuring that the concept of 15-minute neighbourhoods is rooted in what residents want and experience. So to do that, we worked with the Young Foundation and carried out a kind of deep participatory process with 100 people, identifying on what they want and need. So effectively, you didn't want to just guess or even look at research evidence and predicting what that would lead to. And that starting point of legitimacy is really important, because we see 15-minute neighbourhoods as a way of seeing and as a way of working, and what that leads to will be relevant policy interventions that people need and want. And that plays out in for example, residents were really clear on telling us it's great that there are certain things that we do want to need in a neighbourhood, but the way I experience my neighbourhood is as important as what I have. So you need to understand if I'm not feeling safe, then I'm not accessing the things that are provided. If I don't have a high level of trust or feeling belonging with my neighbours, or I'm not confident that this neighbourhood is going to be for me in 10 years' time, then it falls down in terms of the assets that you provide. So we develop a framework based on both experience and also the stuff that people need. And that enables us to see kind of inequalities within the borough and act accordingly. If trust is low or there are certain gaps, then we need to change our approach. So the way of working is important as the interventions for us, and obviously it's rooted in that sense of what's actually happening for people in their neighbourhoods.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'll take a moment to welcome Nicholas Boys, who's just joined us online. Nicholas, welcome. Thank you for being here. Nicholas is the director of Create Streets. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next question, which is, how has the pandemic changed our understanding of what is needed to improve health and well-being of Londoners through public realm design? And that question is to anyone. Maybe I'll start with yourself, Jonathan, because obviously Waltham Forest has had a sort of plan of implementation, and as I understand it, that the phraseology used to describe the organising of neighbourhoods has changed as well. So has that been in line with post-pandemic changes, or has it been with, as you sort of said, that kind of collaboration with local people and seeing a change in how people are responding to the introduction of sort of neighbourhood infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, the research that we carried out highlighted a few things, some of them pandemic, some of them almost other types of signs of the time. Clearly, people are more likely to work at home. Our daytime population has changed somewhat. Waltham Forest is a borough with a high percentage of people that commute to central London. That has reduced significantly. So people are more active in their neighbourhoods. They're more keen to pursue active travel measures. They are have always obviously valued green space, but it's become ever more critical to their well-being. That's what they're telling us. So in terms of how people are engaging with their neighbourhoods, we have seen a change. People shopping locally more, and that's great for 15-minute neighbourhoods. But I'd argue that when we did the research and when we spent time, particularly with people on lower incomes or just struggling a little bit more financially, access to childcare and access to primary health being absolutely critical to their well-being and health within 15-minute neighbourhoods. So we perhaps didn't anticipate that before the research, which is obviously great, but that means that the sort of interventions we need to do, we need to implement the fuller report with our health colleagues, much more neighbourhood local level, and really embed how people are experiencing access to primary health care. And we also need to think about what on earth can we do to support people to create more affordable childcare, whether it's cooperatively or whether it's leveraging external supplies, for example. So those are more surprising things that we wouldn't have anticipated a few years ago that beyond the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone wanted to add anything to that. Stephen, online.
Yeah, thank you. Just for those that don't know, Future of London is an independent network of 5,000 people from London who work in the built environment and regeneration, including a large proportion of local government. And I wanted to mention that because we did a piece of research throughout the pandemic with those members and those partners that was called Our People, Place and Community. So very happy to share that with the committee. And that explored the role of neighbourhood design in fostering social ties. So we talked about health and well-being earlier. One of the definitions that I keep coming back to is the World Health Organization definition, which looks at both physical and mental health, but also at social health as real importance. And that's something that came through in bucket loads during the pandemic as people began to look out for their neighbours, began to support local businesses more, and all of those sorts of things. And so part of our research found that the influences of the quality of our place-based connections can be sort of looked at in three different ways. One of them is the physical design of built environment. The other one is digital connectivity. And finally, it's neighbourhood ecosystems. And I think it's that neighbourhood ecosystems which we found can be termed as the interconnected network of services, organisations, businesses and individuals who are active in the community, both formally and informally. That's a really useful sort of definition of how you can create those social ties, tackle things like isolation and loneliness, and support social health, as I put it.
Thank you, Stephen. I mean, Nicholas, before I bring you in, I just wanted to sort of respond slightly to that. I mean, I think that's exactly, for me, the key sense that I've been getting from a lot of Londoners post-pandemic. I think that certainly came out in the September investigation that we did, which is, there is loneliness, especially in London, is something that I think a lot of people experience, which is odd given how busy the city is, how surrounded we are by people. And I'm so intrigued as to how the physical infrastructural design of our city and our neighbourhoods, either furthers that or lessens it. And I think certainly post-pandemic, things like alfresco dining, for instance, even just being able to sit outside and eat, had a huge impact on people's mental health, improving it and giving people spaces to connect. So that is really the aspiration of this conversation, which is how, does the social health of a community, of an individual in London improve if we change the way that we design our neighbourhoods? Nicholas, I'll bring you in on this.
Thank you. Your last point there was even wider and more interesting than the first one, but I'll come back to your first question and resist the temptation to answer your second. So we also did a piece of research. We did a survey of, from memory, about 500 people during lockdown, and I'll send that through to officials after the call. What we found was that, yes, we came together during lockdown, that access to greenery was strongly associated with greater neighbourliness, but what we call at Great Streets gentle density, where you get some of the advantages of propinquity, but also some of the advantages of personal space and control of your environment, was the most strongly associated with more interaction with neighbours. That over-reliance on cars, at any rate, primary reliance on cars was associated with less neighbourliness. This is during the lockdown. And that actually there wasn't a straight line that denser environments were always guaranteeing tighter communities. actually people in rural areas had greater levels of social interaction during lockdown, which is very much to the point you just made. So those are some of the themes we saw, and I'd say what we learnt from that and from sort of observing society more broadly was it wasn't that we changed direction during lockdown. I think we learnt more sharply what we'd already known, that good fences make for good neighbours, that how you move around matters, and that we both need control of our environment, but also the ability to interact easily with our fellow men and women. I'll stop there. I'll send that through to officials.
Yeah, no, that'd be fascinating. And please feel free to draw on the findings of that survey, because I think that's exactly, I find that fascinating. I think you're right, we just sort of sharpen our learning. And I think especially sort of the increasing move to working from home as well just means that we just spend more time where we live. I think that comes back to the point that you were making, Matthew, about, I did find that fascinating, within 45 minutes you can reach up to, 54% of the job market, which is fascinating and fantastic. But similarly, is that as relevant as it was before the pandemic, given the move towards working from home? And is the move towards working from home a good one, actually? So should we actually be adapting to that? So sorry to throw 101 questions that isn't even on my sheet, but Catherine, it sounds like you wanted to respond to that, and then I will move on and pass over to other committee members.
Well, you're lucky if you can actually work from home, because that means you have enough space, you have the technology and all of that. So hybrid work is everywhere for sure, and for us being a culture that didn't like it so much before pandemic, because the management culture was all about being at work, presenteeism, you had to show up, unlike other cultures like yours and many others. So French culture finally caught back. But do you know the size of the apartment in Paris? Very much like the one you have in central London. So I'm sure you have all kinds of stories, and you guys have done it on the research side, but some families went mad during lockdown, because 4 people in 60 square meter with everyone online because there's school, work and so on. So if there's one thing that we have to reconsider is how do you get more space? So the housing thing, the huge housing crisis everywhere inside the cities, but also in the suburb and so on. But then people have to have shared space someplace else and be able to actually have some sort of comfort, but not everyone can actually be comfortably at home for work or for on-class learning and so on. So we need to reclaim spaces in the streets, and I think we will get there in a second. Enjoying the outdoors is something that is very difficult in cities, even opening your windows. I don't know how you do it here, but if it's something that people also discovered during the lockdown, it's that you could open a window. You could be sleeping at night in a busy street, but there were no cars. So that totally changed the game. Although we also had a number of citizens leaving the city centers, going to the countryside, because they were in need for social health, mental health, for better quality of air, of nature, and so on. So the parklets, the fact that restaurants can have terrace on the street, the fact that you can actually walk on sideways in the street, not be inside the traffic and so on, and meeting people, because if you leave your home, it's also that you can enjoy doing other things with other people and developing community work, place making. I think it's what we've been talking about, to feel a sense of belonging someplace and member of a neighborhood, of a community.
No, thank you. I mean, I think it's absolutely right to draw attention to the fact that, perhaps some of the principles of working from home that underpin the idea that we might orientate towards being more focused on a neighbourhood aren't inclusive of the wider socioeconomic spectrum in terms of affordability, in terms of the space that you have in your home, but also the work that you do in terms of industries and the types of workforce that don't have the access of being able to work from home based on the kind of work that they do. Okay, so this is basically what I think we want to begin to unpack. I'm going to move us on to my final question before I hand over to Assembly Member Baker, which is, I guess now that we've got the lay of the land, this is a little bit more broad about sort of post-pandemic learning of how we redesign our areas and neighbourhoods, if we were to move specifically to the 15-minute city as a model to learn from or to move away from. I've got here that Catherine and Enrica might be best placed to do this, but I would welcome and open it to everyone, which is, can you tell us, how did the 15-minute city concept develop, and what are its core principles? Catherine's gone straight in, so Enrica, I'll come to you afterwards, or anyone else who wants to offer some thoughts on this. Catherine, please.
Well, it's been there. It's always been there. It's a very old concept. It's simply in the air just because, of course, in our group, you know, Carlos Moreno has been looking at this topic for a long time. It's been an inspiration for him, being an expert in cities and also the well-being in city, the notion of livability in cities. But truth is, and you reference one researcher, Jane Jacobs, certainly talked many years ago about that. Many other experts and urban designers in different countries, in different places, at different points in time, talked about to live well and to enjoy a city. Jan Gall, for example, we met him this summer, and you know it's what he has done in Copenhagen. So the reason it's back in the forefront, maybe, and it's also better considered, is because now there is also the climate change, the energy crisis, and the pollution, and the place of the car in cities. But at heart, it's simply about, you know, not growing the cities by expanding further away the services and the jobs and so on, and developing more of a network. It's been mentioned, an ecosystem. It's about polycentricism, so it means I need to have access, and it would be nice when you ask people, they would tell you, if I could access some key element, which in our group we structure that into 6 families of services and equipment. It's your home and everything related to housing. It's where you work and your workplace needs. It's education, it's health, it's consumption, and it's culture and enjoyment. And basically, you can structure everything we do in a day, in a week, and the equipment that we use around those 6 families. That's the ontology, to actually map out at a neighborhood level or at the city scale level, where are the services, and again, going back to the different personas or the different social profile, who needs what, to make sure that actually you get inclusion, because the idea is not to create all the university campus and so on, where you would only have their students and possibly their teachers away from the rest. Actually, this concept should open up to inclusion, diversity, and social mix, and also mix of functions, mix of use. A building should be a place where you can actually have work areas, co-working spaces, but also apartments, shopping activities, and everything else. So it's how we look at it, and how we've been working with many cities. Paris has been the first one, which is why we've been able to test a lot of things with our colleagues from the city of Paris. And but today it's Munich, it's Barcelona, it's Madrid, it's Bucharest, it's Milan, it's London maybe, it's Buenos Aires. So cities are looking at it because it speaks to citizens as well. They get it. In fact, we receive every week so many requests from students, from teachers, to help because they want to do their master's thesis or their PhD thesis on walkability in my city. You know, Carlos was in Poland last week, and he gave a lecture, and at the end of the lecture, they all wanted to focus on making the city a better place to live, because people can be walking, cycling, being outdoor, and enjoying being part of a dynamic.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Did anyone want to... Nicholas, you've got your hand up. Nicholas, is that your hand to indicate you wanted to come in? Yes, but you can't unmute at the moment. That's fine. Oh, you're back in.
Sorry, no, apologies. I lost my link for a second, but I'm happy to wait if that's easier.
No, feel free to go.
And I agree with everything which was said, very, very powerful and eloquent. I just take two quick points, just almost on the history here. I'm a historian by background. Look, you know, until about 120 years ago, we all had to live in 15-minute cities or 15-minute towns, because it was really the only option available. And then, you know, for understandable reasons, about 100 years ago, we invented these things called the motor cars, and we, by which I don't mean just the British, but you know, the French, the Americans, the Dutch, everyone sort of got confused and assumed, because cars are brilliant at giving individual liberty to move around the countryside and the suburbs and out around the whole country, that therefore it was necessary and right to also make it very easy to move around in cars very quickly, you know, in the middle of our city centres. What we now know, I think, and I'll come to the evidence in a moment, you know, I think unimpeachably, is that the externalities of cars in denser places are very damaging, not just to air quality, but to social connections, to safety, to movement about, and above all, to value and to prosperity. And you can see that very clearly in the data. And it's very, very clear, interestingly, I think that all of the 5 least prosperous neighbourhoods in the UK are ones which have got fast dual carriageways running through them or alongside them. So what the brilliant 15-minute city concept is a repackaging of historic idea, and that's no discredit to it, it's a brilliant repackaging of something we've sort of always known, but we sort of forgot for 100 years. And I think we are now, across left and right, north and south, east and west, we're sort of rediscovering, which is that the downsides of cars and very fast movement in town centres is greater than their upside in other places. And then just final quick point is, you sometimes get into an argument about, good design is subjective. That's just not true. There are very discoverable relationships between how we move about, density, urban form, patterns of building, relations to value, to equity, to prosperity, to health, to physical well-being. And I think what 15-minute city brilliantly does is encapsulate those in a concept that people can rapidly get their heads around. I think it's a brilliant packaging of an age-old concept. That's it.
Thank you, Nicholas. We've got Enrica, and then I'm going to bring Emma in for a supplementary, Assemblyman Best. But Enrica, you finish on the point.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is an old concept that goes back to the garden city, then the neighborhood unit, polycentric city, time geography, even transit-oriented development. I think what has changed basically is to the necessity of look back of those ideas with the new lens that are, as was said before, the environmental crisis, that again the social crisis. I mean, the post-pandemic city that we want should be based on the idea of communities. And so again, I think the model that we want to put on place that is different from these ideas in the past is really, as was said before, this social component. So from self-contained individual in isolation during the pandemic into a community. So I think what urban planners can do, of course, is to look at the localization, so the bringing services and activities close to citizens. But together with this, is essential other form to create communities. So which is inclusion, socialization, and really focusing on this social aspects, of care and taking care of the common space and the neighborhood.
Thank you, Enrica. I'm going to bring in Assemblyman Best, and then I'm going to hand over to Assemblyman Baker for the next set of questions.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about, the words I'm hearing: busy streets, where you can't open your window, for noise and pollution, cities like Paris, Buenos Aires, density. What does 15-minute cities look in a more rural setting?
So there is we call it the sister concept, and it's called the 30-minute territory. So we are also working with rural areas or with less dense areas, and it's the same, and with the exception of the availability or not of public transportation. So we do exactly the same thing. We map out the infrastructure, the equipment. We talk to the people. We have developed workshop resources for them to share with us their weekly experience, and then this helps actually substantiate the need to rethink public infrastructure. So there is some sort of a transport, be it small vans on demand, because you've identified a community that actually need to go someplace, and you're strengthening the community. So that concept of acceptable, reasonable access to the main activities you need within a reasonable amount of distance is applicable as well. Simply, the distance will be different, and there is a strong reliance on public transportation.
Thank you. And do you recognise that that's the sister concept of 30-minute concept applies in London?
No, London is not a rural area, obviously. So I
really? There's a few places we could go visiting.
Okay.
So that's just to bring on that concept. I actually live in Jonathan's ward area in Waltham Forest. You can't exit Waltham Forest via public transport. You can barely exit Waltham Forest using a pavement.
Sure.
But you will see a lot of sheep. That's the vibe we're talking about, and that is London.
Sure, but then the question is, why do you need to exit it? What do you need to do to actually limit that, restrict that, or change the patterns of commute?
Jobs, the economies, schools, school shops, local produce,
so
healthcare
that's
facility.
really the heart of the model. The model is an integrative model.
Friends, family, the reason that people want to get out of London,
but
that's why they live on the edge of London.
So there's a difference between the routine and then, the idea is that we all need to, we like to live on weekends and stuff like that. On the everyday basis, the idea would be that you create enough of a strong ecosystem that you can navigate with it, or you don't have to be on a long commute at the same time everybody else is, because maybe you can have flexible hours. So it's one framework.
So, but then, if I start off in the middle of London, my 15-minute neighbourhood is really big and it's really good. And then we get condensed to the edges of London. Then, if we're not understanding that there's a difference,
we will need to look at a map, because really, don't be focused on the 15-minute side. It's really, what are the needs you have? What are the 3-4 things you really need to do? Let's look at where the amenities are, and then let's look at what else can we change or can we redistribute.
Yeah, that's why I was really interested in 30-minute concepts, because I don't want to focus on 15. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Simon Best. I'm going to hand over to Simon Baker, but was that an indication I saw Simon Fortune?
No, I'll show you a map of Bromley afterwards.
Okay. We're going to have a long break time.
One of our wards is bigger than Islington.
Assemblyman Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I'd really like to pick up on some of that in a moment about what this 15-minute cities actually means to London and in different areas, but I just have a bit of a follow-up question on some of these principles about what it means, and it's to Enrica. And have you conducted any research into the effectiveness of the 15-minute city concept in improving environmental sustainability and quality of life?
So we are currently doing this project called Mapping 15-Minute City, and it's all about collecting examples prevalently in Europe of cities that put in practice measures or a combination of measures to achieve some specific goals that are the one similar to the 15-minute cities mentioned before. And so we are collecting also evidences on again different areas on how this had an impact. So for example, it was mentioned Paris, but and I think Copenhagen before. So we have, and I'm happy to share this with the committee, some collection of cases in which, for example, there is an increase of cycling modal share, or increase of sense of community, or decrease in housing-related financial bundles, increase of mixing, decrease in respiratory health issues. So there is a set of indicators that we are looking at, and they are related to some of the policies put in practice. Is usually, again, looking at the practicalities of that is usually a combination of policies, like air quality oriented plus health equity, and then of course they are measured in a set of indicators.
I think we'd be really interested in seeing that information. Just briefly, because I think we'll go on to ask this more specifically about some of the European comparison, something, but you keep referring to measures that are being taken and policies that are being impacted. Could you briefly tell us what sort of things those are? Because I've sort of heard about school streets, which we're very familiar with here. I've heard about some cycle lanes and stuff like that. What other measures are you talking about in terms of embedding 15-minute cities?
Basically, in our work, we organize them into 4 main areas. So some of them are strictly related to sustainable urban mobility. So it's basically prioritize active mobility and reorganize public spaces, or provide access to sustainable mobility options, including public transport in some cases, depending on the site of the city, of course, integrating new technology. Another big set of policies regards planning and urban spaces. So it's about mixed-use zoning, walkable neighbourhoods, or inclusive development, so it's more from the urban planning side. So like designing neighbourhoods.
Can I ask you for just to be even less academic about what you're talking about? Just to, I mean, really briefly, tell me what these things are that are being done.
So yeah, it's, for example, in the case of sustainable urban mobility is closing streets to traffic, create a shared space traffic, or integrating biking with public transport tickets. So it's really providing options and different access to sustainable mobility modes. I don't know if it's enough.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to try and work out whether I'm missing something. So apologies for pushing you to speak.
No,
it's basically as possible to me. So
then regarding the urban spaces, again, it's a focus on the quality of public spaces, the way in which they are designed, and the process in which they are designed. So including people in the decision of how they want it. A lot of time also experimenting. So what they're called the street experiments, that are like trials and temporary change of street use with the help of communities. Other examples are like related to logistics, so it's optimizing logistics and reduce emission of supply chain. So it's like creation of distribution center in some central areas, or at the boundary of the areas where traffic is limited. Or again more, and then the fourth aspect is all about the governance. So really again of stakeholders collaboration, including consultancy process, community involvement in the decision-making process. And so we define 15-minute city when all these four ones are together covered in a way. So from our study, we believe that again, to have what it's a 15-minute city defined, you have to have the four of them together. So it's important to combine planning and mobility, but also governance and logistics. So it's a bit like the combination of the four in a way. And then we are trying to measure the effect, the combined effect as well.
Thanks very much. Okay, so this question is to the whole panel, and it is picking up on the specifics. Some of what I hear, I think, is perfectly understandable to ordinary Londoner, because, of course, you want your shops and services within a reasonable distance. That's not something that anyone would disagree with, surely. Some of that is a bit more difficult, however. But a lot of that we already have. So to what extent is London already a 15-minute city in terms of shops and services? Are there any specific communities where the majority of residents already live within 15 minutes of appropriate amenities and services? Yeah, Jonathan, go for it.
So we have a insight tool that kind of maps the qualities and inequality of the 15-minute neighbourhoods within Waltham Forest, and there are obviously large areas where the things that people have said they need are relatively strong, but it's the experience that is where the greatest inequality is. So and around affordability. So those are the two kind of fractures through what makes a great 15-minute neighbourhood. People are not confident that their neighbourhood is for them in the future, or if they are feeling unsafe for whatever reasons, then it effectively hamstrings completely your kind of the assets that are available, but also
sorry, you're going to have to explain this basically to me again. What services and why can't people get to them?
So I'd say you can map your assets and say that people have they're within 15-minute neighbourhoods, and that's important, and we stay on top of that. But people will tell us that they're less likely to access some of those services, whether it's shops in the evening, because sometimes they don't feel as safe as they could do. So understanding how people are feeling in their neighbourhood is as important as the stuff that's available.
Okay. Right, so that adds a whole different layer on too. So it's not actually whether they're 15 minutes away. It feels like this is a vast majority of local government, to be perfectly honest, that you're all lumping into 15-minute cities at different times, depending on what you want to talk about, to be honest. So,
I mean, it's so we can understand the inequality of experience and then act accordingly. And I suppose more recently, we've affordability of food and access to food has been more relevant in recent 15-minute neighbourhoods, including our own.
Okay. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks.
I think
you might go.
I think there's a danger in thinking that the 15-minute city is just a policy choice or a consequence of policy. I mean, one reason why this is a live debate in Europe is that European cities were largely constructed before the car. So you have a town centre, you have dense housing, and in London you have a collection of small towns or villages with high streets that have coalesced into a single city. So in some senses, the 15-minute city, as maybe you suggested, is an inheritance from urban planning in the past. And we could compare that with the low-density sprawled cities of, San Diego, Houston, etc., that function in their way quite successfully, but they're never really going to be amenable to 15-minute concepts. And I sort of slightly take issue with the assumption that car is necessarily bad. Silicon Valley is probably the most dynamic urban area, winging it a bit here, in the last 100 years, but it was based around a car economy. And in rural England, when we talk about 15 minutes, perhaps for many people that should be 15 minutes by car. That is the practicalities of a 15-minute life in a rural area. And I think there's also an element of culture here, that some cultures, I'm maybe thinking of the US, are very attached to the car as a symbol of personal freedom, anti-petrol taxes, and the more collectivist mentality, people who, high-income people who don't mind sitting on a bus in the morning, it's just a normal activity, are more amenable to the 15-minute concept. So I think this is not just about policy and planning, it's also the historical legacy of planning we have. Maybe this is European difference from America.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I find it difficult to know which way to go with all this questioning, because it's I think I express it's like nailing jelly to the wall, understanding what is part of this, what's not part of this, and everyone seems to have a slightly different interpretation of it. But sorry, so the question out to the rest of the panel, to what extent is London already a 15-minute city, and are there communities where the majority of residents live within 15 minutes of the appropriate amenities and services?
Yes, could I?
Thanks.
Could I come in?
Yes, no problem.
Thank you, and thanks for the question. We have a report that sort of came out about a year ago, where Monica Jane and Shivani Bhatnagar, they explored the implications and limitations of the 15-minute city concept in London using the London Travel Demand Survey. Mm-hmm. And their conclusions were looking at the data, and this is pre-pandemic, so obviously things have changed a little bit in working patterns and so on. But they concluded that pre-pandemic London was already, by and large, a 15-minute city for many purposes, except for work and, to a certain extent, leisure activities. And so they looked at why people need to travel in their day-to-day lives, things like go to take children to school, go to open space, go to the pharmacy or your local GP, and as already been mentioned, go and get food, go to your groceries, shops, cafes, restaurants, and so on. So all of those other categories they found were, by and large, within 15 minutes of majority of Londoners. So I'm happy again to share this with the committee.
That would be really helpful, thank you. Nicholas, did you want to come in too?
Yes, just very quickly, and I sense your frustration. So look, I was going to half say what Stephen has just said, which is that most will be, and it'll be less so as you get further out, but you probably already knew that. I think if the concept is unhelpful to you, what I think I would suggest is almost to change the question, which is, what's the way in which we can manage our streets and public spaces in our planning policy to maximise prosperity and well-being? And I think the wider evidence suggests, not exactly as just said, that cars are always bad. It doesn't say that, but what it says is, as you get into denser areas, lots of London historically is that, and quite a lot of the villages around which London grew, less so some of the suburbs between them. As you get to denser areas, more people living in them, if you can create or steward places to be easier places to get around multimodally, sorry, that's jargon, forgive me, walking if it's most helpful, cycling, jumping in the car if that's most helpful, then that is associated with more jobs, more prosperity, knowing more of your neighbours and leading more purposeful lives. So I'd almost sort of, if the 50-minute city doesn't help you think about what London should do to itself, I'd sort of change the question into that, and then you get slightly different answers in, say, Waltham Forest or Westminster or Ealing or Epping. But it can be broadly a function of how good the public transport is and how dense the housing is. I hope that is a little bit helpful.
Thanks. Just want to come on, I deliberately sort of didn't speak about work earlier on, but work, as I understand it, is part of the things that you should be able to access within 15 minutes, which seems particularly well, it's inappropriate in all sorts of places, but we're here to talk about London. Particularly inappropriate for large swathes of people in London who have no choice about where their work is, working in transport, working in infrastructure, construction, and all sorts of things like that. How, especially since we're talking about some of this rising to prominence after the pandemic, where the inequalities between those who could stay at home to work and who couldn't was so stark. How is this so not acknowledged by so much of what we're talking about, that so many people are not going to be? And also that communities, I mean, this is a slightly different question, but London's communities aren't always about who you live next to. They are about a whole swathe of things, and some of that involves things that are further away than 15 minutes. There are reasons that a lot of people live in London. So why are these things and the specificities of both the economic and the social aspects just not acknowledged really in any of this discussion? Sorry, I don't know why I looked at
I'm just wondering who's brave enough to answer that. Enrica has her hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I think my hands was for the
previous question. Sorry, if you don't want to answer this one, that's also fine.
But regarding, I think it's a bit related, because so you about East London a 50-minute city. So I see, as other panelists said, it's really a collection of small 50 minutes neighborhoods. If you look at Google Maps, it's really like the old villages, the yellow one in Google Maps, that can be defined from a functional point of view, a 50-minute city. All the rest, so all the gray area in Google Maps, and especially the outer boroughs, it's really hard to close, to define them, or even try to transform them to what we have in mind as a 50-minute city. So I think it's crucial to look at these inequalities that exist, and also how this type of measure should be different according to the spatial geographical dimension we look at.
Okay, thanks. Would anyone else like to?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier that not everyone can be teleworking from home. That included as well the people who cannot work away from their workplace at all. But again, the question is not how do you make everybody fit within this framework, and the question is really how do you create an environment, and that requires that people will need to change their behaviors, and sometimes even their jobs, but they don't have to comply to the model. The model is not something to achieve or to live within, like you are in or out. It's an approach. It's a philosophical approach. There are elements to it. There are things we can do, but you cannot overimpose this. And certainly, no one is saying to someone to change homes, change job, and so on. So you cannot look at this and call it the 15-minute concept, which I've almost never mentioned that when I spoke. I'm talking about proximities. It's the notion of proximities more than any time and dimension and duration of transportation. And it's really starting from the model of looking at, am I happy if I commute 2 hours, which many of us do as well in other cities in the world? Is this the life I want? And if I could do something different, would this be possible? So this is the bigger question. And planning policies, planning regulation are not going to help that. It's really a question that goes back to how do we create those aspirations and those visions for life.
Yeah, I think, I suppose the question is this a helpful concept then if it excludes so many people's experiences? Is this why this is difficult? Maybe this is why I'm struggling with what it feels is a very abstract and academic concept, whereas the basics of, yes, we should have nice high streets, yes, walking routes should be good, yes, people should be able to cycle if they wish and take public transport. But how is it translating it into such an all-encompassing concept? I know you're saying it's not, but that's not what I'm hearing.
No, and I understand
how
your
is that
point.
helpful? Is it not actually completely unhelpful, and that we should actually just concentrate on the constituent parts that people would back?
But it's part of it. So it's a different vision for living in cities. And again, I don't know. My English is probably not helping. But you are not going to convert London, because we are not converting Paris either, and we are not converting Munich and anything. We are trying to say in some parts of London, and I'm very humble, I have no clue which part it would be, so I'm really sorry of my ignorance in that matter, but I can speak for the other cities I know best. And right now, except for maybe Copenhagen and a few others who have been on that path for 20 years, the first streets in Copenhagen were closed to cars because of what was said before, because the municipality, the size of the city, the philosophy of the Danes allowed this to happen. And that means people grew up with this vision that they have local jobs they can do and they don't have to commute far out, but it's Copenhagen, it's the size of Copenhagen, which is not exactly the size of London. So for me, the question is not whether London should be a 15-minute city, has to be, or shouldn't ever consider it. It's the London question. What kind of city and future city do you want? Which I think you have experts on the panel. This is one approach. It's an integrative approach. It's not an academic approach. It's actually quite a practical approach. But to implement it, to develop it in London would require a roadmap, and would require that we don't start with the places that are the most difficult and where people don't have choices. But when you are in that cycle, and because it's an integrated approach, you need to deconstruct a lot of things, which you cannot deconstruct buildings, roads, and so on. But you can certainly start to offering some services, start moving things away so people choose to live differently. It's really down to that. So it's not something to consider or not to consider. It's actually a framework for urban design, but it doesn't need to apply everywhere, and there are many other approaches that have different sets of priorities. But if the priorities are around safety and security, which you have to be able to go out and actually enjoy the street. If it's about local jobs, so people don't need to own a car. If it's about breaking the symbol that you have made it in life when you have a car, maybe to have made it in life means something else. All of those are very complicated questions that requires many alignment among many stakeholders.
Thank you, Catherine. And I didn't mean to try and get you to answer detailed questions of London. And can I assure you that your English is fantastic and approximately 1 million times better than my French. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Baker. I'm going to committee just to update you. Skip question 5 because I don't actually think it's in the flow of this conversation. So I will be passing on directly to Assemblymember Best to go to question 6.
Thank you. if I could just, Catherine, whilst I at least ask the question, I mean, what I've struggled with the concept is, and that maybe you can help as well, is if you look at, for example, London, right? If we look at central London, I think someone might have to correct me, but already it's 70% of households don't own a car. You know, is it that whole thing about having a car to make it? I don't think that exists. And then you go to inner London, and it's something closer to 50%, and then outer London, and I think it's somewhere like 70%. So these things, it naturally, to me, just follows good availability of public transport. And I know there's other things kind of thrown in the mix around better air quality, better jobs, better public services, but really that's just going to follow the urban density, and urban density is naturally going to bring with it better public transport, right? And that's I don't want it to sound like I genuinely try and follow what that natural concept of urban intensification, which differs from a 15-minute neighbourhood, because in order to have all those things, we know how you have those things naturally. It's through intensification of development, and then those things kind of come with it. But does 15-minute neighbourhoods say we'll have those things without urban intensification? And how's that possible without urban intensification, if so?
So again, if I can leave you with one idea here today, is forget the 15-minute, really. And think about, is it desirable to be living in those neighborhoods you're talking about? Are people happy? Do they want to stay? At some point in time, do they have a change in their life cycle and children or grandchildren? And actually, do they need more? That's the key question. It's really not the measurement of 15 minutes, 2 blocks, 4 blocks, 5 blocks, really. And so I think, again, that the better question is, how do you make London a desirable set of villages, neighborhoods, districts, boroughs, you name it, where people can actually enjoy doing what they do and visiting public spaces, and there's only one cathedral sample, right? So people will be closer or very far away from it, the same way I'm far from Le Louvre in Paris. But as a vision, as an aspiration, I would love to be able to say I can do most things I need to do without being dependent on a car, even without being dependent from a public transportation, and that is what most people would like to do as well. This is not the way we have created our neighborhoods, because there were other priorities which were totally understandable, centralization and so on. And now we are trying to undo a bit of that because we see rising cost of other things, energy, transportation, air quality, air pollution, and also exclusion, simply exclusion. So this is what is packed into that concept. So don't look at, where are the things, how far away from them they are located. That's really less important than the rest.
Okay. I couldn't help think when you said that thing about, are people happy? And the thing I hear over and over again in areas like mine is when you hear things like 15-minute neighbourhoods, the reaction is just leave us alone. I don't know if that's something you get as well, but people don't like the changes. And anyway, but on that note, I'll move to Jonathan and ask what policies or initiatives have been implemented in Waltham Forest to promote the 15-minute city concept, and what have been the initial results or challenges?
Yeah, I suppose most historically it will be the Mini Holland Enjoy Waltham Forest policies, and that is, if I remember, 22 kilometres of accessible cycle lanes, obviously improvements to pavements and public spaces as well to promote active travel. 2018 study saw life expectancy improvements for the next generation of children, 51,000 residents experiencing significant improvements in clean air, 25% improvements in clean air overall through the borough. And so those active travel measures were the vanguard of us thinking about 15-minute neighbourhoods. More broadly, the framework itself is a way of looking at success, but we're in the early stages of that effectively.
Thanks. And so things like obviously there's been some opposition to things like Mini Holland and LTNs, but when I look at the reaction in the south of the borough compared to places like Tower Hamlets, Islington, there's been a really kind of negative and large reaction in those boroughs, which hasn't occurred in the south of Waltham Forest. So what do you think is the difference in implementation, which has meant that, and like I say, there is some opposition, but largely those measures have been received positively compared to other boroughs, which are very similar kind of demographics, and close to 15-minute neighbourhoods, but they've seen a very different reaction?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly diverse, different perceptions and different reactions of, let's call them active travel type changes or actions. Some of it is levels of trust, some of it is the already existing level of car ownership, some of it is the scale of change. It is honestly hard to say. I would say in Waltham Forest, and you may disagree with this, but I think the resistance, for want of a better word, to these type of measures associated with Mini Holland and Enjoy Waltham Forest have reduced because of positive examples of their implementation, where that might not be the case for other areas of London post-pandemic.
I don't think I did disagree. I think I agreed.
Oh,
I
sorry,
said that it was actually that you could tell that it was warmly received, and the issue is in other boroughs which are quite widely similar in terms of road connections, public transport. You haven't had that same experience. One of the big complications, though, with things like we talked earlier about school streets, and that's one of the key pins of that, and the fact that you can't have a school street without a CPZ, which is stopping areas which aren't so densely populated from exploring that option. How do we go forward with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the technology that sits behind it and the cost of the administration of that. So it would be a trade-off between whether or not it could be implemented without the existing technology and process with the CPZ or not. And I think it's a financial decision rather than an administrative one.
Just when we're talking about the difference in London and difference in areas, I just think that perhaps some of these policies have to move to be able, if they want to fit other areas of London, there's going to have to be a shift in how they're delivered. I don't know if that's a point you'd agree on.
Yeah, it's a point I very much agree on, and I mean, I think there's a few things around 15-minute neighbourhoods. I think the work point is really relevant. Residents in Waltham Forest told us they don't expect to work locally. In fact, they just want access to great public transport, and that's how we've built the model. And London is, that's the way London works. There's also a kind of hard rule of like drawing borders around people's neighbourhoods is problematic to people. That's obviously quite practically, people quite live near those borders, and it's not a 15-minute neighbourhood, but also that's not how people view their neighbourhood. It's much more dynamic, and it's a way of having conversations with them. And let's pick north of Waltham Forest, for example. People's priorities and experience will fundamentally be different to other people's in the borough. There are some things that people have told us that are absolutely important. Active travel is important, access to key services is important, but we use it as a starting point for conversations around prioritising and improving key aspects of 15-minute neighbourhoods that are most relevant to them.
Nicholas has got his hand up as well.
Oh, sorry, it's really difficult here.
Sorry. Just quickly on that, I mean, I can't speak for Waltham Forest, and Jonathan will be delighted to know I'm not going to. But I mean, just quickly, if it's helpful, the advice that we Create Streets tend to give to councils or to people working in neighbourhoods in trying to make their places better, and probably in a direction that goes with some of this conversation, is first of all, and I'm sure no one on the panel does this, don't demonise people who drive cars. That's A, dumb, B, stupid and impolite. People who are demonised and said, you're obviously going to resist change, and quite rightly so. People in much of the country and much of London need to use cars as things are currently constituted. So that's point one, and I think sometimes that's forgotten and it needs saying. Secondly, perhaps more profoundly, find gradualist win-win processes for improving places with the consent and, wherever possible, with the active leadership of local neighbourhoods. So that can be planting street trees, making it easier to walk or cycle and move around rather than making it harder to drive. Start with the win-wins. So that might be planting street trees. It might be creating what are called Copenhagen crossings, which is a way of having sort of continuous pavements along side roads. So the pavement, if you like, is more prevalent than the side road. Pedestrianise or part pedestrianise high streets or town centres or village centres, on a Sunday or on a bank holiday. Just make it an experiment and allow the shopkeepers to see how it goes. Maybe things will be worse, maybe they'll be better. Very often their takings will rise. So find ways to bring people with you on that journey. And if they don't want to go, then they're not going to go there, and you probably can't force them. And ultimately, often the best place to end up, though some streets may be pedestrianised, is to turn humans back into the primary species, and cars very much welcome on streets, but they're the guests rather than the other way round. It's very interesting. If you look at a photo from 1920s or before, you see far more people, including children, walking on the carriageway, because it was just a much safer thing to do. In fact, there's academic research on this, and I touch on it in one of my books. Children used to roam far more freely, far more liberally around the town and the city than they do now. They're far more constrained, they're far less free. So find those ways to liberate people and free people up is the advice we typically give to how to avoid that type of pushback. And typically that then is linked to more prosperity and more interactions. I hope that is helpful.
Thanks. I think, Jonathan, you did kind of cover this in some previous answers, not only to me, but earlier in the questions. But to what extent are communities consulted over policy decisions necessary for delivering urban planning models, such as the 15-minute neighbourhood?
Yeah, to try and answer with an example. So, for example, we have something called area frameworks. So where areas that are going to experience fairly significant change, development, regeneration, we would build on the insights and the understanding of 15-minute neighbourhoods, but have conversations using the tools and methods that we used in developing the framework to understand what people's priorities are within their area, under the framework of 15-minute neighbourhoods, and really kind of test the model and invite people to look at it and identify their priorities and the things that they want within the change. So effectively they're designing their 15-minute neighbourhoods through that process.
Thanks. And actually I was speaking to the committee before we started this about the fact that in Waltham Forest there's now a new concept of equal neighbourhoods, and what does that mean in relation to 15-minute neighbourhoods?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not aware of the term.
It comes from your brief. It's from it's part of the new housing management strategy and the growth strategy.
Yeah, so I can't. Sorry, I don't understand the concept.
Okay. Silos. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, no problem. Assembly Member Best, I think that is yours finishing, so I'll pass over to Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll try not to go over the points again, but there are some really interesting things that have come up in the discussion so far. So I want to start with Jonathan, and so more broadly than simply engagement over the plans that you have locally, I'd love to talk a bit more about sort of embedding the concept in people's minds when they're doing all kinds of other things within the community, and specifically how we might influence the next London plan. Because if you look at the last London plan, it is pre-pandemic. It focuses a lot on sort of access to services and things like that, but mainly as a question of whether to allow more density in an area. It's the other way around, if you see what I mean. So they say, shall we allow more development in this area? Well, only if there is access to services. And the kinds of policies that I think you're talking about as a local council are looking for where you have gaps to fill. You talked earlier about how the work that you've done had exposed inequalities, and I'm assuming that means that you've found areas with significant density or lots of population who have no access to a particular kind of thing. or have access to it, but it's across the dual carriageway and therefore there isn't a sensible way to get there. So I'm just wondering, what are you doing to try to get people to ask for changes in your area as engagement? And how are you going to try to change policy within the next London plan or the next transport strategy, because they're both related, at the GLA end of things?
Yeah, there's a few practical things involved in that. I mean, we use the 50-minute name framework to support decision making and understanding where those inequalities are, but we're also inviting people to identify small improvements they can make within their neighbourhood. So somewhat inspired by Paris's participatory budgeting process, but on a probably much kind of initial scale, with a set of funds that have derived from the proceeds of development, and what do you want to do with it in your local neighbourhood.
Is that local SIL or strategic? Sorry, SIL being Community Infrastructure Levy, which the borough levies on development. Is that the right?
It's partly that and a range of other pots from different areas. But yeah, I won't bore you with them.
You're putting that in local ward level control?
Yeah, pretty cool. Yeah, exactly that. And then people are obviously keep putting ideas through, and they're under the kind of principles of improving their local neighbourhood, and that's closed very, very recently, and looking at the kind of actions that will be implemented there. But it kind of brings it to life, and obviously invites people to share what's working as well in terms of the improvements they want to make. And then in terms of influencing policy more broadly, we're looking to kind of share our experience and understanding of putting this into practice, which we're still learning as we go on that.
I was wondering if Stephen wanted to come in on that issue as well. Obviously, your job title is Head of Knowledge at Future London, and clearly we're thinking ahead. We're trying to measure things in a different way. I'm making a massive assumption that you're the person on the panel most likely to want to talk in detail about the WebCat tool that Transport for London provides, that literally will give you a map of what is a 15-minute cycle from a spot, and then tell you what's within that spot, what's within that 15-minute radius. So you can look up Central Bexley and it'll tell you that there are no GP surgeries, which is, that is just to back up what Peter was saying. That tool exists. But are new tools like that needed? Are new metrics needed? Are new goals needed for the next London plan that could be fixed by development policies? Stephen, that was directed at you. Sorry, I know.
Yes, no, thanks. I got that. I have been involved in consultation, sort of working on how to build more social value into the London plan and to the policies there. But I have to say, I'm sort of 6 weeks into the role, so I'm sorry to disappoint. I like the sound of the tool, and I do agree generally with your premise of your question in terms of more tools, more data, more analytics. And I think I could point the panel to, you'll all be aware of the recent launch of the London Output Area Classification, jointly between Liverpool University and UCL and others, I believe, which provides really fine-grained data on socioeconomic households in many different, across the whole of London. And so I'd refer to those sorts of data as input into the policies. But I'm very sorry at this juncture, I can't answer very specific, in terms of the level of specificity that you're asking. Sorry.
No problem at all. We have Enrica. Yeah, you got your hand up.
Yeah, maybe just quick add on the tools. So I will be happy to share something that we developed within a European project, and this is an accessibility tool that actually measure how much a spatial point is accessible from different services, and we also implemented it for London. So, this is a free access tool, so you can play a bit with it, and it's something that we tested with some practitioners and also TfL. So this might be interesting for you to know. I will send you, of course, the links and everything and how to access it.
Great. I have a feeling that might be the basis of the tool that I'm looking at, which I'm calling WebCat. But that time mapping sounds exactly like.
Well, actually, yeah, WebCat can give you access to the transport pod. What our tool says, which is accessibility analysis for different transport modes for different services. So it's basically how much GPs, how much. So it's but again. I will send you the link.
That is what I'm looking at. Those exact 4 things. Yeah. Okay. Great. And so I'm wondering if anyone else on the panel has any views on this. I think potentially Nicholas, you've got views on sort of the interaction between density and good planning, and the extent to which the current sort of public transport accessibility levels and the measure ATOS, access to opportunities and services, are used to control density within planning. Is there a different way around that we can go, where you kind of set ideal levels of density and then add also requests for more things that would contribute towards services being within reach?
Thank you. I'm very pleased you turned that question from specifically on the tools as currently used to more widely. Otherwise, I would have had struggled to answer. Yeah, more widely, I'd say. So I can't comment on the tools being rolled out. I don't know. I think we would argue, based on our research, that I think it got a little bit better in the creation, but that there's a risk in some of the public debate and some of the plan making over the last generation that density's been seen as a one-way street, if you'll forgive the pun, either more density is always better. That's not correct. There are huge advantages to density. It obviously allows you to live more sustainably, and I wouldn't decry that for a moment. And it comes, obviously, the more density you have, the more you can support public transport, the more you can support other amenities, the more resilient shops and buildings can be, because they've got more access to people and to activity to keep surviving through different life cycles of building use. But there are disadvantages as well in human sense of control of their environment, in immediate access to green space, and thus in personal well-being. And I touched earlier on the research we did during lockdown, but it echoes lots of other research before and subsequently. Most of us, particularly with children, want to have immediate access to greenery. That's obviously harder to do once you get beyond a certain density. And most of us use, data on this is a little less robust, but tend to use local shops and services less when we're about the 5th or 6th floor. Jane Gall's done some work on that. And things that just get harder to have as density goes up too far, such as very modest front gardens. Modest front gardens, as just a metre or so deep, are ideal for knowing your neighbours and for interaction with them, because they're not so big that you're hidden behind the rose bush, but there's enough space there that you might be out there, tiddling your roses, and your neighbour goes past and you say hello, and you have an interaction. So we would always make the case that somewhere between, so this varies, but somewhere between 50 and about 200 homes per hectare optimises those advantages of personal control and space and access to your own green space, or at any rate communal to a finite number of people, versus the lower land use and the greater sustainability of development patterns. So I think, I don't have a magic wand, I can't rewrite the London plan, but were I doing so, I would tilt it, and indeed other local plans I was influencing, to be trying to get that optimised. And so you'll feel like you're not getting the public pushback, you're helping public health and mental well-being, but you're also getting some of the resilient and sustainable advantages of good placemaking. I hope that's a helpful answer. Obviously, it's not on the detail of current measurements in London.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm just trying to ask about sort of metrics that might resonate with people. I do agree with the basically all the members that have weighed in, and the panel members who said that essentially saying a 15-minute city is what you should want is not the best way to engage with people, and asking people what they want and maybe trying to sort of deconceptualise it a bit is a good idea.
If I may quickly, I probably didn't use the phrase then. I try and talk about beautiful, walkable, gentle density, where you know your neighbours and it's easy to get about, and I find that resonates more powerfully with the public because it's less conceptual.
Exactly that. And then, but then at a planning level, you do need to have some kind of metric or measure. And so I think possibly those of us who get involved in planning get excited about a concept like that in a way that the public will not. But yeah, passing back to you, Chair, for the rest of the questions.
No, thank you. I think that was actually quite a helpful summary of this section so far. I am going to give everyone a break for about 10 minutes, a deep breather. I hope the panellists have enjoyed the robustness of the conversation. We are politicians, we're very opinionated, but we are very grateful for the time and the expertise that you bring. So, even if there's been robust dialogue, it comes from a place of, hopefully, representing the views of Londoners that we're here to sort of politically mandated to represent, but also to try and get to the heart of this kind of evolving conversation around how do we redesign our city. So we'll be back at, I think, 3:42 I'll bring us back, and hopefully see you then. Thank you. all this way. So for the next section, I think I'll be passing over to the Deputy Chair, Assembly Member Fortune.
Hooray, thank you very much. I reckon, looking around, I know probably the least amount about this from everyone in the room. I'm pretty confident about it. So I came at this meeting quite cold, and I've learned a bunch of stuff, and I've been scribbling things down, and so I've got my thoughts. They're not necessarily structured, but I just want to consolidate things in my head. What have I learned? 15-minute cities aren't really about cities, right? Because it's interesting, there's been a mix of people talking about cities and neighbourhoods. And when you're talking about neighbourhoods, you're talking about access to local facilities, schools, that sort of, and then from what Matthew was saying earlier, and from what you were saying as well, Catherine, you know, if you're going to visit one of the, there's 9 cathedrals in London, interestingly enough, I do know that, then that's going to be a different kind of journey. It's going to be outside of the concept of the 15-minute neighbourhood. But then we've learned, don't worry about the 15 minutes either. It's actually about proximity, and it's having access to things and how you access things. But I guess when you start thinking about this raw, and perhaps this is some of the tension you see, people will think about the places that they live and work and play in, right? So I grew up near in Lambeth, near Brixton, which meant I was probably never more than 5 minutes from a pineapple, right? Right up until I moved out to Bromley, where if you think about Bexley, Bromley, Croydon, Sutton, in that outer London loop, which is about 3 o'clock till about 7 o'clock, there isn't a tube station. So when people start thinking about 15-minute cities, if you go and talk to people out there, they go, hang on, this doesn't make any sense at all. But you're not talking about that, because you're not talking about retrospectively refitting huge parts of London. It's really a philosophy about how you go forward, how you might tinker with things, as you've done in Waltham Forest, but to make sure that you've got access to those local facilities when you're developing planning, that there's green space, that you can walk and cycle where appropriate, which, okay, makes sense. But then we've also talked about the fact that we kind of do that anyway, I would have thought, in the planning process. Nicholas was saying about 100 years ago, and sort of, you know, looking back at how we did things there. 100 years ago, we didn't have Sainsbury's, we didn't have sprawling secondary schools we have now, we don't have specialist medical clinics which people will need access to. So again, you can't think about that closed concept of 15 minutes, and you can't think about that closed concept of cities. So coming at it cold and just listening to what you've said, it kind of, I see what you're getting at, and that makes sense. So what do you think some of the pushback is? And there's really visceral pushback when I went to do a little bit of research online, and especially on social media. What do you think's causing that? Maybe Catherine, you can go with your excellent English.
Thank you. There are different types of pushbacks, but as you very nicely summarized, it's sort of it's a framing approach, and so the pushbacks are against one dimension that basically deconstruct the whole thing. So some of the pushbacks are around the fact that you are limiting people, or you are creating a sort of a vision, a framework where people cannot choose where they go and so on, which is not the case. We are just simply creating some conditions so the majority of people, based on everything that was said before, have access actually to reasonable time and distance to the things they need to do. The main pushbacks come from the need of alignment. There needs to be some alignment. We talked about work. We could have spent some time talking also about consumption, because in the end we speak about the essential things you need to buy every day, your grocery, your dairy products and so on. As Nicolas said before, because of the car, because of the access to broader distance we start having over the past couple of years, we also have different shopping habits. We order online, it's been touched on, and we can calculate the impact of that, the delivery and so on. But I don't know how it's like for you, but the Sainsbury, the Tesco's and so on, they are not in the city, they're a bit outside, so people need to go there because that's where they have affordable prices. And if they buy locally, then prices are higher, so you have to do something about that, and it means interfering somehow in the private sector by saying local shops, local goods, local employment, and so on, to create this environment where you want to buy from your building main floor and your local grocery shopper and so on.
And that's some of the changes that's going to be needed. I think Who was talking about, I think we talked about school streets earlier as well, and you talk about it as a single journey. Oftentimes it isn't a single journey. Often that's part of a journey that continues on to perhaps a different school, perhaps a place of work, or perhaps a place of travel. And which means when you're developing all of this, it's going to look at things like school start times, childcare facilities, what time people are working, train timetables, for example, because if you've got condensed and you're pushing people or compressing people into certain time slots to hit an arbitrary 9 o'clock start in London, there's going to be pressures there. But I'm straying from my sheep. We were moving on now to look at sort of the exemplars of where it's worked and some of the challenges that we've seen abroad. And Catherine, you touched on Paris earlier. Could you just sort of remind us what were the key successes and challenges with some of the implementation of the concept being rolled out?
The main successes are the quality of air and the reduction in accident, in car-related accident, and the fact that people are able to enjoy the streets and be outside and actually stay in their neighborhood and also engage themselves more in citizen-led initiatives. So the participatory budget that Jonathan mentioned is one of the big things in Paris, that you can actually take a vote or propose to create a temporary experiment in a street, decide to reclaim some space and build a vegetable garden with your school and so on. So those are the main success factors. There are several measures around environmental air quality and reduction in the NOx emission, the CO2 emission. So those are really the more quantitative element. Yeah. Then on the qualitative side, if you survey people on the streets, they will tell you that they are able to enjoy somehow more their neighborhood, to interact and get chances encounter with people that they would never meet before because of the lifestyle they had and because of the rhythm of life as well.
Okay. So a lot of those gains that you talked about, that's because of the removal of vehicles?
Yes.
Right, okay. What were the challenges? What were the main challenges that you would say were faced?
Resident wanting to keep the parking spaces they had, and all the people within Paris that were against. I mean, I don't know if you realize that a couple of streets, major axes, are now not anymore available. So increase in traffic jam, increase in frustration, increase in all kinds of dimension related to that.
Yeah, we had sort of similar discussions around LTNs when they were rolled out in London. Okay.
And as you know, maybe some of you, our public infrastructure in terms of transportation is what it is. I mean, it's functioning quite well because people are moving several hundreds and millions of people every day from east to west to north to south, but it's crowded. So the quality of your journey on the line A is terrible, and that hasn't changed.
Right. Okay. I've not been for a while. I'll go back. So if I can open it up maybe to other panel members, are there examples of successful rollouts of schemes, let's call it the 15-minute schemes across the UK that you could cite? I know we've had some examples from Waltham Forest, but are there any other examples that perhaps anyone here or on the screen could point me to? No's fine as well.
Nicholas, go ahead.
Sorry, for some reason my mouse is very sticky. It takes a while to put it on and off. Forgive me. I mean, look, actually, the most successful scheme in the UK is London over the last 30 years. I mean, it wasn't bad, just a 50-minute city, but I don't have the figures in front of me as I speak, but the shift, above all in central London, but in a bunch of neighbourhoods outside central London, Waltham Forest prominent among them, the shift to not to getting rid of cars, but to just making cars not the only option. That's the key way I find helpful of thinking about it, which is the car is still there as an option. It's just not the only option. You're adding in other options. That's clearly been associated with, the renaissance of large bits of London, over my lifetime since the 1970s. I think it's probably central Manchester has probably been the closest to that in any UK city. York, I think, has been another one which has seen a complete transformation of the town centre over the last 40 or 50 years. Yeah, largely about constraining but not preventing the car. I'm sure there should be other examples jumping into my head. I think Edinburgh's been a bit more problematic. I'm not in all the detail. Outside the UK, Paris, Toulouse, Pontevedra, many Italian towns. I think there's a whole gamut you could point out. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, that's useful. I think the other question I was going to ask has been covered off already, and mindful of time, I think I'll hand back.
Oh, thank you, Assembly Member Fortune. Assembly Member Baker, you wanted to come in briefly on this?
I did, yeah. I just wanted to come in after Assembly Member Fortune's question about case studies and experiences and ask whether there are any examples of case studies or pilots that are focused on the provisions of services and not around how people are getting about. So, provisions of local services.
Yeah, perhaps I can answer. We had a speaker from C40 Cities at one of our events very recently, and I know the mayor is the chair of that network at the moment. They have a global network of cities, and Melbourne has a 20-minute neighbourhoods program, and in there they list about 20 features of a 20-minute neighbourhood, which includes things like housing diversity, sport and recreation, affordable housing, ability to age in one place, which is quite interesting, safe streets and spaces, local playgrounds and parks, green streets and spaces, lifelong learning opportunities, schools, health facilities, local employment opportunities, and so on. And so they are looking at the sort of services available within that kind of time frame. There's a number of other
Can
quite
I
interesting
clarify
international
though,
examples
because
as well.
Can I
Yes.
clarify though, because that again sounds like the list that is given for 15-minute cities, but not necessarily. And it could be that Melbourne has actually done this and has actually changed the provision of local services and, say, prioritised, more local GPs if that's necessary or something like that. But are there actually examples of and apologies if you don't know, but maybe we should go and look at Melbourne, but that's what I'm actually looking at. Has anyone concentrated on the local services provision rather than just how people are getting around?
I know that Nicholas and Jonathan had indicated. I don't know if it's in response.
Sorry, I'm finding it really difficult to see everyone at one time. So I'm definitely not trying to ignore people. I'm just trying to work out who's coming
And also,
in.
can we minute the request for scrutiny to fund our trip to Melbourne as well?
Absolutely, haven't been for a while.
You.
Yeah, although I think we were going to Paris first.
Or Paris, both.
Yeah.
Why choose? Is it Nicholas or Jonathan?
Well, Jonathan should go first. I'm happy to join in afterwards.
Two very practical examples of, for example, the way that we're trying to work with people really want to access and have a more visible police presence within their neighbourhoods as part of kind of sharing their understanding of 15-minute neighbourhoods. So very practically, pop-up police stations within libraries using the assets that we already have, and we are piloting something called Safer Streets programme, which is a much more kind of participatory problem-solving approach to improving people's sense of safety and also improving provision and broken windows and things like that really drive. So it's we're kind of responding to that, and it's very kind of local examples. And the way also that we've designed family hubs pilot, so an extension of children's centres, people really making them a much more holistic provision and lots of housing advice and domestic violence support within there, getting much more local to people that need them, particularly the places that need them most.
Okay. Is that partly a reaction to the fact that we have actually had some services, local services, removed, like police stations, though?
Very much so, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Was Nicholas?
Yes, just a very quick answer. I mean, there's almost a different level of detail to Jonathan's, hopefully helpfully. So, there's been a huge change over the last 50 years in the way we approach planning and use classes, both in new places and indeed in the management of existing ones. So, go back 50, 60 years, and the whole direction of planning policy was to segregate uses. Residential over there, retail over there, work over there. During the course of the last generation, that's completely changed. So the assumption, I think it's probably fair to say that every planner, in every town and neighbourhood across the UK, certainly London will start with, is that we should be pushing for mixed uses. That's not complete. So clearly, you're not going to have an iron smelting works in the middle of a residential district. But within the bounds, if you like, of normality, normal commercial, we're pushing in that direction. And I think that fundamentally, the more activity you get into a neighbourhood, the more you're then supporting services organically to adapt. Because if you've got people working, shopping and eating all within whatever time frame you want, that will support more services. So I think strategically, we've shifted back in that direction in many places, not perfectly, but in many places over the last generation.
Are we not losing huge amount of light industrial and workspace in London, though, to residential?
I should probably refer that to someone with the London data more than mine. No. I think there are definitely people on the panel better able to answer that.
Okay, maybe we'll leave that hanging. Enrica.
On examples that focus on distribution, localization of services, we can add, for example, Milan. So they introduced, together with policies for increasing accessibility for walking and cycling, they at the same time introduced policy to facilitate local business, small scale enterprise, neighborhoods, cafes, also because of the closure of many shops. And I think this is a central aspect, the quality of the high streets and how this is changing. And it's so much related with what we are talking today, I think. So looking at also different policies that really focus on the role of shops and livability and vitality of high streets is central, especially if we think of how these small 15 minutes neighbourhoods in London are organised along. So the role of the high street is crucial.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
If I can add something, we are documenting. We are documenting. There is a website. It's currently hosted by C40 because we work with them. We are their scientific advisory team, and so there's a website on C40. It's called Sustainable Proximities. There are around 200 projects that have been identified. I think on your specific question, you should look into Paris, and I'd be happy to provide you with more information, because the mayor of Paris has actually created a new company that is based on public and private representative, and she's looking at reclaiming also some empty shop spaces to allow those local services activities. And they just had a meeting a week ago, and we now have the new map where those empty places are, and again the citizen can say, okay, here we need a bookshop, here we need something else, and so there is that dynamic going on. Rome in Italy, so Milan, we know this project, and it's centered. The city of Milan is really trying to embrace this by actually really converting parking spaces into something else. So there is a drive from reclaiming that space, but bringing in new services, and some of them being public services. And Rome is doing the same. Rome has adopted this idea of Rome within your proximity. So those are really good examples.
Thanks very much. That's really helpful, Catherine.
That was really helpful. And Asenma Berry, I know you have the next question and you wanted to come in. If you don't mind, if your follow-up wasn't around PDRs, do you mind if I come in now? Because I think this is the point in which to ask question 5 that I relocated. Okay, please go through it, and I'll come in afterwards.
So, Catherine, you've been talking about proximities. Obviously, 15 minutes is a time, and that's a distance. Is there a good reason for talking about time versus distance, or is distance just what we should go back to talking about? I mean, obviously, in cities, you've got real severance because you've got railway lines going through the middle of cities. So something as the crow flies is not useful. So can you explain how we got there, and whether we should just go back to distance and we should measure it in terms of accessible distance or something like that?
That's a really good question. We think in isochrones. So we really think in terms of how much time do I need to get to a point, knowing that sometimes there is a place to walk, sometimes not. You were discussing Nairobi. We were there in June, and you have people everywhere walking very long distances. So it's both dimension, because it depends on, is it a hilly territory? Is it flat? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it snowing? Is it raining? What are the environmental conditions? So the 15 minutes, it's simply, I think it resonated everywhere. We didn't invent the concept. 20 years ago, Melbourne talked about 20 minutes. Portland in the US, the Swedes and Danes have talked about 5 minutes for a long time. I think it's just a symbol. It now has become something that people talk about, but I think the reality is that you walk, sorry, I'm going to speak in kilometers, but it's between 4 and 5 kilometers an hour. You divide by 4, you get the 15, the quarter of an hour. So people can say, okay, it will take me 15 minutes. No, I'll just do it. But there is really not any scientific truth behind that. And sometimes that distance doesn't convert with, the amount of energy, effort, and so on you need to put into the doing of walking a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, depending on the context.
Sure, thank you very much.
But in the study we do, and so I wanted to mention, we have developed a digital tool, which is a cartographic tool, so we can map those assets we were discussing earlier, and we can decide to actually map out the 15-minute isochrone by walking, by car, by public transportation, by bicycle. We've been studying how much further you go if you use an electric bike, because it's an interesting thing to think about, because again, I don't know how difficult this is to do the bicycle in London, but in Paris there are hills and so on, so we see more bike down and less bike up and so on, but with more people moving towards the electrical bike, they increase the distance. And some people, when we do surveys, say, okay, yeah, no, I can do the bicycle 20 kilometers each way because I have the electric support, and this is enriching my reach.
Great, thank you, Chaire. You can take over.
Thank you, Simon Berry. It was just to return to that thread that we had just sort of began opening. I think Nicholas, yourself and Catherine were talking to it. It was just about the use and the change of use in terms of whether our high street should be mixed use. I mean, Nicholas, I was really enjoying kind of being walked through actually sort of the change in perspective from planners in the last 50 years, pushing more recently for this idea of mixed use. And I wanted to unpack whether that's a positive thing or a negative thing for our high streets. I mean, what's underpinned this conversation, whether we do, focus it specifically around the 15-minute city, or just more broadly those sort of slightly more open-ended questions that I think have come from the panellists that I've enjoyed around how do you design an area that best suits the needs of Londoners. For me, whether, no matter what the landscape of that area is, central to any person's, I think, local needs is having a thriving high street, a place where you can go and you can have, a laundrette or a grocery store, maybe a cafe that you can sit in. I'm probably going to leave really obvious things out, maybe even a hairdresser, etc., etc. And what worries me is the increased use of PDRs, permitted development rights. I don't often like jargon, especially in planning, even though there's lots of it. But yeah, PDRs, you can't really dress it up any other way. And the particular more recent change in PDRs, so I think that's the sort of classy, enabling what was previously retail in our high streets to be converted to residential. So you might have a row of shops, again, the hairdresser, the laundrette, the grocery store, and then right in the middle of it a block of flats, because of permitted development rights, which not only allow the retail to residential conversion but also allow you to bypass local democratic decision making of the local planning authority, because they can be implemented without planning permission. So I'll be honest with you, I am really wearing my Labour stripes in this particular perspective, but I find PDRs could potentially compromise the fabric of our high streets, and therefore what a neighbourhood. And I think if you reduce the offer of what a high street has for an area, you reduce the cohesion of a neighbourhood, which is again at the essence of this actual investigation. So I wanted to ask the panel what they thought about permitted development rights, the particular change in the last few years to see class use E from retail to residential, and there are current proposals at the moment the government is consulting on about going further with PDRs. So I was hoping someone in the panel might want to speak to their opinions on PDRs, and I think Nicholas has started off by indicating.
If that's helpful, happy to come in again. Just for 30 seconds, because say a quick addition to what Catherine was helpfully saying, and then I promise I will answer your question. It's certainly correct, as Catherine was saying, that it's time, not distance. If I may, I'd also add, and it actually does link into PDR and high streets, it's also the quality of the time as well as the time. So there are really quite a range of studies now in various places showing that, if a walk is pleasant, There's nice things to look at. It feels safe. Your tree line is not too hot, not too cold. You know, obviously we're more likely to do it. So actually, and this comes back to planning and placemaking, the quality of the street, the breadth of the pavement, that you're not just walking down some huge glass canyon, has a provable effect on what that 15 minutes means and how people are likely to make use of it or otherwise. I hope that's helpful. And then just to come back to a very important question about high streets and permitted development. The evidence is really clear, I think, that high streets need to evolve, and that clearly there's been quite a lot of hits over the last few years, above all with online shopping and with changing patterns. The consequence of that is, this is from memory, so I wouldn't swear to these numbers, but I think the latest number I saw across the UK, I don't have the London data in my head, is that 17.5% of shops were vacant. That's less the case in places like London, and certainly when you come outside, the prosperous southeast and a few other hotspots, it's particularly problematic, and the flats above high streets even more so. So I think PDR, I think the best way to think about it is bring the democracy forward. So it's clearly not good, for the high street and for housing, for shops to be sitting there empty. I think we can all agree on that. But high streets need to be active. And if you can't have shops in there, and as a statement of fact, that some of those are not going to fill up with shops, can we get offices in there? In fact, the Crate Streets office is a former shop that we converted into an office, or indeed homes. And so what's the mechanisms? PDR could be one of them. I think a better one is local development orders, which exist since the 2011 Localism Act, for putting a really clear quality ask, both in terms of what's inside and how it faces the street, how the services are met, but within that clear carapace, to then allow change of use to be reasonably organic. Certainly in the extended bits of high streets, you may want to protect the absolute core of it, but I think it's very hard to see a situation in which high streets are going to go back to having as many shops as historically they did. Maybe that's a bad thing, maybe it's inevitable, it's probably perhaps both. So I think we need to find the mechanisms to allow it to happen organically without trying to micromanage every change, but within a carapace of place quality. And clearly some of them, many perhaps, of the PDRs that have happened in terms of their impact on the high street have been malign, and that I think needs to be constrained whilst allowing change to happen, because if we don't allow it to happen, things will just sit empty. I hope that's a sort of helpful and non-partisan answer. It's meant to be. Thank you.
I don't know if I'd agree that it's non-partisan, Nicholas. I think I think it comes from. I don't understand how bypassing local democratic decision-making of a planning authority brings democracy forward.
Because may I respond to that, or
please?
I don't want to take too much airtime. Then I promise I'll be. No, I mean I'm saying precisely the opposite. Which is I'm trying to bring the democracy into the local plan. So the local council, through the local plan or an SPD, is setting a really clear local development order. So if you like, I'm talking about bringing the democracy forward to be more strategic rather than abandoning it. So PDRs take you into a situation where you're losing control. I'm making a case for re-establishing that control, but doing it strategically rather than trying to do it all case by case.
Okay, so maybe not through PDRs, but actually the idea of having mixed use of high streets is something that should be more embraced by local plans. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
and accepting that the change will happen, and that the alternative of not letting the change happen is places sitting empty, which can't be good. I think we'd all agree.
I would agree with that, and to that end, I would love to get that information from you, Catherine, about what's happening in Paris in terms of being strategic with the empty spaces. I mean, Nicholas, I think I agree with you. I think if there are empty spaces in the high streets, we should do everything we can to encourage the use of them, because empty spaces, I think, generally in London, when you see empty homes and you have homeless people, it seems absurd. And similarly, when you're in an economic sort of crisis, to see shops not filled also seems absurd. But I would argue that if there were empty spaces, perhaps we need to look at the conditions in which we are stopping local businesses thrive and fill up those spaces. Because I think if you saw homes being put into places in high streets that were previously shops, I would argue that you would see more of those shops decrease, or you see more of those shops shut down, because it does just change the fabric of the high street. In terms of noise, in terms of footfall, in terms of the feel of a high street that would previously have been communal shared space suddenly becomes people's homes. And so that kind of, some of that more interesting dimension that you actually started off telling us about, in terms of like that people need communal space, but they also need private space. I would say that actually if you began mixed use of our high streets, you would probably blur those lines to a point where neither would be achieved. But that's just my perspective on that. Catherine, did you want to come in on this? I don't know if you were indicating or not.
No. This is the most complex aspect of this framework, because it's much easier when you can have the zoning of, where the corporate business district is, when all the housing are, and so on. And so by mixing that's where you have to have this stakeholder alignment, but also long-term vision, and align on the key benefit and outcome of actually changing that, which is really difficult.
Okay, thank you. Matthew.
Sorry, third time running. I keep forgetting. So taking up this point about empty spaces, I mean, having no empty spaces is not a good thing. I mean, it can be a sign of a dynamic high street which keeps regenerating itself and, changing technology and fashions and what people want to do with the high street. But it's difficult to imagine what is going to happen to the high street in the future. I think during COVID there was clearly a bit of a renaissance of corner shops, people shopping locally. But since COVID, I mean, partly boosted by COVID, partly technological change, I mean, some things we just automatically include in our list of 15-minute city, things like supermarkets, cafes, doctors, banks. Actually, these are disappearing from a lot of high streets because they're going online because of technological change. So it's about how technology and how people want to interact with doctors. I mean, I don't think this is a good thing. I still want to go and see a doctor in person, but it is increasingly difficult to get in-person appointments. So perhaps that's changing, and these things are going to disappear from the high street. And home working is going to have a big effect, but it's not clear which direction this is going to have on the high street. So I think a few people have said this, the impact of home working is exaggerated. I mean, even the company Zoom have told their workers to come back to the office. But whether in the long run this is going to lead to, let's say, people working at home but in their local community, so taking their laptop to a coffee shop, or whether banks are going to turn into co-working spaces that people can take their laptops to and do a day's work, 10-minute walk from home, is an open question, or whether this is going to lead to greater privatisation. Houses are going to be redesigned so two adults can sit there and work for the whole day in private little booths at home. It's difficult to say whether this is going to be public and local or whether this is going to be more private. So I think empty spaces, big question mark about how that's going to evolve, and the impact of COVID and the impact of the 15-minute city on that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are some really helpful prompting questions for the committee to take away and maybe unpack in another space for us. I mean, I think you're right about a lot of those sort of key anchored institutions like banks, like supermarkets, that previously were so fundamental to people's lives are beginning to sort of disappear from our high streets. And I partly wonder, again, what are the many layers of an environment in a society, economically, sort of politically, socially, that a government creates that sees the disappearing of vital services. I mean, one of the other things that we saw from the pandemic was digital poverty. And if a lot of these very core services are being moved online, who is excluded from accessing them, and who does society begin to serve, or who does it not serve, and the role of government in parity of that. Thank you for those sort of prompting questions. I think there's a lot to go in and unpack. I think it is now Assemblyman Baker, who you said you feel satisfied that your question was answered on question 14. Yep. So then, if it's all right, I'll move over to Assemblymember Best. Sorry?
You skipped 13.
Oh, sorry, I thought you did cover that, Assemblyman Berry. Please come back in then. Please come in.
Cool. So this is an important question, and it kind of goes back to the metrics that we use in the way that we assess how well we're doing. Are any of the people in the panel aware of, or can tell us about, urban planning modelling that takes into account people's accessibility needs or mobility needs and difficulties? Because that seems to me that sort of it's very fundamental. It's part of equalities legislation that we have to take it into account. Are we measuring the accessibility of these services to people who have mobility needs of different kinds, and is that a hurdle that needs crossing by cities? Who would like to answer? I don't know who's got the answer to this, but I strongly imagine Matthew might have thoughts, and Catherine.
Not particularly
Can you use your microphone?
Not particularly the practical aspects of planning. I mean, that was my point. Alan Berthaud defined cities in terms of affordability and accessibility, and he talked about an hour's commute as being about the most anybody wants to do, and a commute that doesn't cost more than about 15% of a household budget. So he was thinking about cities. He talks about cities as labour markets, and that's how he thinks about good planning. So accessibility for people who are more challenged in terms of their accessibility could still be using those metrics, but it would just be a harder experience for them.
I think that's right. Catherine, and maybe Jonathan, you've had some feedback as part of your work from disabled people's groups. I don't know. Oh, sorry, I was going to go to Catherine first. I was just giving you a warning.
So it's a metric. It's definitely a metric that is included and is looked at. In France, it's mandatory to provide access to people with disability into public spaces, public buildings. It's also becoming something that is a must-do in the private sectors and so on. So I don't think it's connected to any sort of planning approach. I think it's something that has to be done.
Have you had any feedback that any of the changes in Paris or any other cities that you're aware of have had feedback that it's made life harder or worse for certain groups, particularly disabled people, to bring in these measures?
We haven't documented structurally any. We don't have any data points that are specific to that. But there is a European research project right now going on to study that specifically. It's the University of Munich who's driving it, and it's called Accessibility Study for People with Disabilities. I can look into it.
That would be very interesting for us to see, I think. Jonathan, yes, sorry, you were going to...
No, so thank you. Be really quick. The metrics that we embed within the framework are accessibility level metrics, which aren't ideal, but you can get a fairly kind of decent understanding. And when we did some deeper focus groups with people with disabilities, there was quite a strong emphasis on quality of pavement and street furniture. So quality of pavement metrics are captured within the 15-minute neighbourhoods. More specifically, we do a resident insight survey twice a year, 700 residents, fully representative, including some social demographics and protected characteristics. So we get an understanding of how that neighbourhood feels for specific people. Obviously, it's not sample builds over time, and we start to get a better understanding of inequality of experience, and that helps decision making.
Thank you, that's really useful. Enrica, you've got your hand up now as well. Thank you.
I can contribute by mentioning tool that we are putting in place. I don't know if it's the same one that was Catherine was referring to. This is again from a European project where Technical University of Munich is also involved, and so we developed this tool called YAPI, that is Inclusive Accessibility by Proximity Index, and basically really look at these specific groups. The problem with this tool that the more you go into the details, that the more they are expensive in terms of times and data to collect. But so there is a method that we put in place, and I'm happy to share with you the results and the application we did in Bologna.
That sounds fascinating. Yes, please, can we have that? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblyman Berry. You finished with your line of questioning. Fantastic. Assemblymember Baker, you felt like question 14 was answered, so I'll pass over to Assemblymember Best.
Thank you, Chair. I just have to say, I think you're going to be really concerned when you hear some of the things your Labour leader is saying. You said you were wearing your Labour stripes earlier. And also, I'm really pleased to hear you care about...
Don't you worry about my concerns, Assemblymember Best.
And I'm really pleased that you're also concerned about the digital gap. So I'm sure you'll be taking on Lewisham Council with their things like cashless parking.
Don't you worry about Lewisham Council, you worry about Waltham Forest, Assemblymember Best.
I am. On that note, so I just want to pick up on the accessibility point. Jonathan, when I sat on the Children and Families Committee, we picked out from a consultation a SEND child couldn't use the family hub because of the fact that the parking had been so reduced in that area, and they said we can't access this. So we said as a recommendation, can we look into this? And the chair of that committee and the response was, we can't because that doesn't fit in with the 15-minute neighbourhood.
Actually, I wasn't there for that specific thing, for that item. But my understanding is the 15-minute framework doesn't prescribe hard rules on those sort of decisions.
So how can we make sure things like that don't happen again? Because I'm sure you understand that was wrong.
I don't know enough detail from
I'm sure you would presume it would be wrong to discount the concerns of a disabled child not being able to use a service because of a 15-minute neighbourhood.
From the human point of view, yes, but I imagine there's a whole range of trade-offs and complexity around that decision that I'm not aware of.
I don't think there's any trade-offs in making sure most vulnerable people can access services, but yeah. Okay, I was going to ask as well.
May I make an additional point on that, just very quickly?
Yeah.
Not on Waltham Forest specifically, which I can't do, but I think more broadly, the case for giving people more choice about how they move around towns, neighbourhoods, cities, so that those who can, wish to, and choose to use public transport or walk or cycle, whatever it might be, certainly as I foresee it, is exactly that. And I'm not commenting on the individual case, I can't do that. But so for those who need to use a car, for whatever reason that might be, it's actually easier for them to do so, and there's likely to be less congestion, precisely because those who perhaps for reasons of joy or utility or cost, whatever it is, choose other modes are able to. So certainly as I conceive it, the 15-minute city, in inverted commas, done well, makes it easier for people who are reliant purely on cars to use them seamlessly. That would be my hope and aspiration.
Thank you. I was just going to open up to anyone to answer on this, but are there any social or cultural factors that influence the adoption and the success of a 15-minute city model, and how can these factors be addressed in London?
Someone say something, otherwise I'll have to do it again, which I don't want to do.
Go for it, I think.
Okay, well, I'll be very quick because I think in a way your question sort of almost begs the answer. In the bits of London where people are not car dependent already because of changes over the last 40 or 50 years, this is quite a natural and easy route to go. Where you're working in areas where, as a statement of fact today, people are car dependent or largely car dependent, clearly if you go through a process where you're criticising them for being so, or you're removing their choice before you make other choices available. I'm not saying that has happened, but were that to happen, that's clearly going to rub against people's desire not to have things done at them and their sense of control of their own daily lives. So I think where people are relying on a certain mode to get around, you've got to be respectful of that, understanding of that, and find those win-wins. So I'd be always very nervous of doing anything other than that. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. Matthew.
Hey, remembered. Okay, just a couple of points. I mentioned earlier that 15-minute cities probably work better where there's a kind of more of a collectivist mentality. People are happy to use public transport, kind of Europe versus the US, where I think there's more of a cultural attachment to car use. I think probably 15-minute cities or 15-minute neighbourhoods work less well when people are resident there because of the accidental coincidence of affordable housing and access to work, rather than they're in the neighbourhood because of some other region, like there's a hub like a church or synagogue or mosque that a lot of people live and attend the mosque, or a kind of ethnicity, a particular language group, people from a particular region have settled there, so there's some extra dimension to them being in a particular area. So I would think 15-minute cities the idea would be more amenable to that kind of situation, the kind of ready-formed community, as it were.
I would agree with that. I was going to say that one of the underlying dimension of proximities is the sharing for the common interest, for also shared common assets that you can't multiply. So as we work towards developing those projects and transforming the neighborhood, we actually engage a lot with all the communities to say, okay, it's one swimming pool, we have to share. So are we working through looking at access time, specific times for retired, for the schools and so on. So there is a dimension of moving away from maybe ownership to use, and therefore looking at sharing what we have all in common.
So does 15-minute neighbourhoods always have to be about restricting car use, telling people how to get around, or is that an unfair criticism of 15 neighbourhoods that that's all they're about?
I think it's going to be my last response because I do need to go, but it's a consequence, not an entry point. It's the consequence of actually saying, if we want more space, if we want to reprioritize for people to be safe in the streets versus the cars to dominate the streets, this is some consequence, but it's not the entry point. But it's likely that there will be some form of change of the number of cars, of the speed of the cars, the time they can be on the street. So it's an important dimension, but it's not the entry point, and it's certainly not the only one.
But it's integral.
Yes.
And I think if I can come here just briefly, very quickly, I think it's also the consequence of the increased number of vehicles and size of vehicles that are present on our streets. And that's been clearly documented over the last 30 to 40 years, that those levels have increased and the size of vehicles have increased. And I don't have it on the top of my head, but the sort of statistics of the amount of time that each vehicle is parked and not actually in use, providing utility for people to travel around the town, is quite significant. It's north of 80%. And so if we think about the space provision for those vehicles to be parked and left there, not necessarily providing utility. So it's, I agree with the previous speaker completely. It's not the objective, but it's a consequence of the evolution over the last 30 to 40 years.
Thanks. I think Assemblymember Baker wants to come in, but I just want to then ask, if it's integral to the very concept of 15-minute city, is it then a fact that we can just say, for example, we talk a lot about Waltham Forest and people won't know this, but the south of the borough is a completely different place to the north. Is it right then to say that if making people not be able to drive where there is no other infrastructure to do anything else, it isn't a system that's going to work for everywhere in London?
But again, that's not the question. The question is, how do we share the space between the human beings and the cars? And how do we take into consideration what human being needs to do, the inhabitants, the visitors, the people who are delivering the goods and so on? And how do we not prioritize anymore the fact that people will use cars that need to be parked, that only drives like 4 miles a day, and that are not used for the rest of the time, and that only have one person in the car? So
if the fabric of the community needs cars.
Okay, the fabric of the community may need car, but do we talk about personally owned car? Are we talking about shared car? Are we talking about cars that are used more than what is used today? So but it's not the entry point. The entry point is, what kind of life do we want in that community? And the car is one aspect, like another mode of transportation.
And also, if I may, I mean, suburban London, when it was built, much of it, there were far, far fewer cars, to Mr. Stevens' point, than there are now. So, Metroland, 1930s, 1950s, were far fewer cars, far smaller cars. People walked or cycled more. There was more public transport in many ways then. So I think it's giving people those choices again, naturally, and then going with the flow of where they want to be in terms of how they want to get about. I agree with the thrust of the question. We can start by restricting choices.
Thank you to Catherine as she exits, because I think she's been a real fantastic guest, and she didn't hear the goodbye, but I'm sure it's a sentiment that she felt on her way out. Sorry, Nicholas, back over to you.
No. Well, I think I'd probably completed. Sorry, I didn't mean to stop you thanking Catherine. I think whose English put all well, certainly put my French to shame.
Thanks. Can I come in, Chair? Yeah, thanks so much, Assemblyman Best, for letting me come in, because I wanted to just pick up on two things that you were talking about there that are really sort of crystallising in my head, and is this sort of two different versions here about what the stated aim of 15-minute cities is, which is about people being able to access and live their lives, if they so wish, within a relatively local neighbourhood, and the actual outcome, which in reality tends to be almost entirely focused on exactly what vehicles, modes of transport they're using, it seems unhelpful to me, to be honest, because of course the provision of local services is not actually really to do with whether you're in a car for them or not, and it seems to me also that we've touched upon at various points the fact that there are a variety of national and regional policies which effectively make it more difficult to fulfil the aims of 15-minute cities, local neighbourhoods and things like that. For instance, we were talking about less provision of banks, which of course lots of people do their banking online, but I think generally people do want to be able to access a bank every now and again. We talked about police stations, we talked about PDRs limiting all this. I've mentioned, although we didn't talk about it a lot, the removal of light industry and stuff like that. So this is a massively loaded question, so I apologise, you're all going to look at me again and not answer it. But is actually what happening is that we're trying to deliver something that people want, but a whole bunch of bits of maybe just where society is going or where government policy is going or whatever is pushing against it. And so that means that local authorities are trying to affect what they can affect, which is just bits of transport policy. Now, is this actually what's happening? Because I genuinely don't see it, and I apologise because Catherine is now gone, but I don't see that while reduction in car use is a very, very laudable aim, that less parking spaces means that people have the services and doctors and schools and things that they want on their doorsteps. Is that a contradiction that anyone else can recognise, or it's Enrica, please, thanks.
Oh, thank you. I think, you asked to deconceptualize the 15-minute city, but I think it's important maybe to stress some things. So why I like the fact that there is all this attention for the 15-minute city, because there is finally this attention to access. So and access is the main aim, as you said, and so we have like three means, which is mobility, proximity, and connectivity, digital connectivity. So if we frame everything like under this concept, so again, we can use mobility, but again, the aim should always be access. We can reframe proximity by adding small shops and activities and mix, or we can work at improving digital connectivity or reduce digital connectivity depending on the services, depending on what we want. But the thing that we actually should measure at the end is really the access. So going back to your question, yes, I agree that in the end there is this type of confusion by mixing the aim with the mean, and that many at the end we end up in just talking about mobility, but it's just a tool that we have to achieve something bigger. I hope I give you some answer to your question.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Enrica. Has anyone else got anything to Matthew?
I think it's such a simple and crude metric to think of, 15 minutes listing the local services that are available in 15 minutes. And we've already said 15 minutes can mean a huge difference, even if we're just walking, compared to single person with a small child, person in a wheelchair. And physically, I'm 10 minutes walk from my doctor's, but I long ago gave up trying to get appointments with the doctor in person. I mean, I've got a friend who's a doctor. I kind of send her WhatsApp messages if I'm feeling a bit under the weather. I'm 10 minutes walk from school. I'm lucky it's quite a nice state primary school. But schools vary enormously in quality. There's one in my area, but if it wasn't good, then physically I would have to think about moving to a different area. So the school might be 15 minutes, but it misses that dynamic of people having to shift location and that being capitalised into house prices and that becoming an exclusionary mechanism where on paper it's a state school, but it actually means expensive house prices in that catchment area. And technological change is it still important to have banks locally? I mean, I love not having to queue up in banks, and I do it online, it's fantastic, but my mother still posts people checks, and who knows what. Somebody with a busy job doesn't actually ever have time to go and deposit a £10 check into the bank account. And people work long hours out of their neighbourhoods. London is it's a labour market. People travel an hour. They do their shopping at a supermarket near their work. What is their neighbourhood? So I think it's important, but it's only a starting point, and there's so much more nuance and complexity behind it. And there's a danger of, once you set a target like there must be this within 15 minutes, that it introduces lots of other distortion. So I think it's a helpful planning idea, but I think the idea of labelling a city as a 15-minute city is a kind of a bit dangerous and a bit of a crude effort, although I think there's lots of good in the concept.
Thanks, Matthew. Shall I hand back? Does anyone want to say anything, or shall I hand back to
Thanks.
hand back to
Assemblyman Best. Yeah. Thank you for letting Assemblyman Baker come in between.
No worries. Matthew, you just kind of said it then, but I kind of thought over this discussion, and Catherine said a few times, like, don't think of it or don't call it a 15-minute city, and some people said that should we just stop using that term now, 15-minute city?
Just before anyone answers, just to say we are losing you, Nicholas, at 4:40, aren't we? So I wanted to make sure we did say thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yes, I've got a train to catch as well,
yes,
and if I don't go in the next couple of minutes, I won't. So yes, I will go into the
exactly. So if you disappear before we get a chance to, thank you very much for your time and your expertise.
Pleasure.
But who's going to answer some of Best's question?
I mean, why not forget it? I mean, in a sense, it's just the latest incarnation of a very long list of alternative descriptions for exactly the same thing. So Clarence Perry in the 1920s New York talked about neighbourhood units. Jane Jacobs and her mixed-use 24-hour walkable neighbourhoods. New urbanism was the buzz thing in the 1980s. Compact cities, and now it's 15-minute cities. So I forget it. Why not just talk about accessibility and affordability? And that, so my mother should be thrilled to know she's been discussed so much in City Hall. My mother lives in a tiny village in Suffolk, and for her 15 minutes is by car, and it's only ever going to be car. There's no practical alternative to that. So for accessibility and affordability, car is appropriate for my mother. I live in Tooting, I can walk everywhere with ease. I don't need a car. I would if I lived in Suffolk, but there's no need for me to have a car. There's no restrictions on me having a car, but I just don't need one. So accessibility and affordability are very different things for me in Tooting from my mother in Suffolk. So I say, forget the city, let's just talk about accessibility and affordability. That illuminates more than it obscures, and I think the idea of 15-minute obscures. I think it can be a nice thing, and it can mean important things to people, but I think accessibility and affordability are the better concepts.
Thank you. I'm sure Sakina can send a thank you letter to your mum as well for the...
We'd be very happy to do that.
I just put in a final very quick thought before I disappear. Just a bit of that. So, I mean, I totally agree. This is an age-old concept. If, as a consequence of some of the debates earlier this year and some of the some of the currents in this conversation, the concept of 15-minute city has come to mean to too many people constraints on their liberty to move about, then it's not doing its job. This is about creating places, yes, people can afford to live in, that they can get to, in which they can lead happy and connected lives where they can get around on their daily needs without being completely dependent on things that are expensive or difficult to do. That is an age-old concept. Whatever we call it, that I hope will remain as an aim of planning and of public policy and of good placemaking. And it's something I would hope that nearly everyone across the political spectrum actually can agree on ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. And as much as I'm loving this note to end on, I do feel compelled to sort of rephrase the last question, because honestly I found the conversation so... Go for it.
There's one more question.
Yeah. From you?
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to get to 17, but yeah, you're right. Assemblyman Best.
Thanks. It's to Jonathan. Have you faced resistance from concerned stakeholders or businesses that may be affected by changes in urban planning policies?
Around 15-minute neighbourhoods, particularly. I don't think so. I think there's probably. I mean, there
definitely has been. I mean, Sadiq Khan got chased out of Walthamstow by an angry shopkeeper who said that the LTNs were closing his business. I mean...
Sorry, I was speaking in the last 9 months on the 15-minute neighbourhood framework. I mean, the resistance around active travel measures was visceral at times. I think that's fair to say, and I'm sure. I'm sure, I mean, talking about the 15-minute neighbourhoods is a helpful definition. I think we've mitigated a bit of that in a sense that there isn't the drawing of boundaries, that it was a participatory process. But, of course, there is some ideology loaded with it, and for whatever reason, in terms of the stories over the last 12 months. And that does require some careful explaining in community meetings, for example. But, yeah, very... decreasing resistance and conflict over active travel measures over time, but I wouldn't say we've had too many challenges on 15-minute neighbours, mainly because it's a way of having conversations rather than a way of prescribing how people should live their lives.
Thanks. I don't want to take up time because we're running close, but if there's any ways in which you've addressed those concerns, if you could send those to committee, we'd be most pleased.
Thank you so much. I mean, sorry, the point I was making before, and apologies because I didn't realise question 16 hadn't been asked, but you're right, it hadn't. It's just this idea of, I think the conversation has been so fruitful and it's left the committee, I think, probably with a lot more questions, which I think we'd like to go away and unpack, but also perhaps even a reframing of what it means to ask, how you design a local neighbourhood to meet the needs of Londoners, and actually whether 15 minutes as a concept is adequate. So I'll sort of rephrase this final question really, which is I think for us to go away and take on next steps in terms of our lobbying to the Mayor of London, but also to the government, which is what is it that you think the government and the London Mayor should do to create the kind of political, economic, social environment for some of the concepts to thrive around? Maybe let's build on the language we've ended up using: accessibility, affordability and well-being of Londoners in their neighbourhoods, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, those from low socioeconomic backgrounds. What policies help sort of neighbourhoods thrive and allow people to live flourishing lives? And what can we do as a committee in terms of lobbying the Mayor of London, but also the government to create that environment? So who would like to answer that question so the committee is left with some next steps?
Perhaps I can just start quickly. I think we've heard about quite a few of the measures and the policies throughout the discussion. It's been really, really rich discussion. One of the areas that I see in the current debates is that where people have a clear understanding of what the concept is, as in imagine your life and the services that you want to access are more convenient, and some of the words that has just been described by the panel. So the 15-minute sort of city concept has become so popular because people see it as an imagination. How can I imagine my place to be more accessible, more fun? And I slightly take, I disagree that London is purely and just a labour market. Clearly that's a major part of what it is, but we're also a cultural capital of the world, which creates delight for all of our residents here. So it's more than just the calculations of getting from A to B to get, I understand the calculations of affordability and of labour and those things. So sorry, I'm longer than I intended to be, but I guess to be able to lobby city and national government on talking about the aspiration and the imagination of what it's intended to be, and not using the language that has come up of what it isn't intended to be, which is restrictive.
Thank you, Stephen. And what I normally do is offer guests the opportunity to offer any closing remarks. So if it doesn't sort of speak to specifically the question, do feel free to add anything before you leave that you might have wanted to leave the committee with that you might not have had a chance to so far. So thank you for that, Stephen. Enrica, Jonathan or Matthew, I don't know if you wanted to add anything before we close. That's a no from Jonathan and a yes from Matthew.
So I think there's always a danger in focusing on what's wrong, what needs to change. I mean, we have an amazing starting point here. Is one of the greatest cities in the world that is a magnet for people to visit and come and live. Poor people, rich people. So we've got a very successful starting point, and I think what's great about Tooting, I think a lot of the concepts of the 15-minute cities are why I like living in Tooting, that there's all these, the supermarket, the pharmacy, pubs, cafes, restaurants, all within 15-minute walking distance from my house. I recognise that I'm speaking from a particular position, and the disappearance of the bank has much less impact on me than it does for other people. And I don't need to have a car. But having this collection, this kind of wonderfully London idea of collection of 15-minute neighbourhoods is I think one of the reasons why London is such a livable city. It makes a difference. South East London lacks tubes, so there's another question there. But it's not what makes London a great city. I think what makes London a great city is that so much of London is accessible within about an hour. So in Tooting, I can go for a night out in Theatreland, go to 40 different theatres. I can go 100 different Chinese restaurants in Chinatown, Indian food in Brick Lane. I think this meeting here illustrates another reason why London is a great city and not just a collection of 15-minute cities, is that Mamuna was able to source this kind of great mix of people to come and listen from a world-class university and experts from all over the place, who I presume most of us are within an hour, or Paris is only a couple of hours away, and we have this expertise. London as a labour market, or as this collection of expertise, we can have this discussion in London in a way we can't in a lot of other parts of the world. So I think 15-minute neighbourhoods make London a kind of very lovely city to live in, a very convivial city, but I think that it's not what makes London a great city.
Thank you, Matthew. So I think that might bring us to a close, unless, Enrica, you wanted to add any closing remarks from your end.
Maybe just one last thing, just to stress again the social component of the 15-minute city. So how much is fundamental to take into the consideration, not just the functional aspect of it. So again, which services, which type, which cultural activities, but really, the role of community, the role of sharing and creating like this different way of living post-pandemic. So this aspect, I think, I really would like to put into attention. But maybe just use this final minutes to thank you for inviting me. It was really nice to spend the afternoon with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Enrica, and thank you to all the panellists. I mean, I think this is probably the point where I say we have now reached the end of our session, and a big and warm thank you. That was a full 3 hours, so I appreciate, on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, for everyone to have stayed engaged and offering sort of very thought-provoking ideas, questions to leave the committee with. It's been much appreciated. So thank you to the guests for their time and contributions today. And it's also been great to have an audience. We've really enjoyed being able to, know that our conversations are part of a wider study of planning and regeneration in London. So you're welcome back anytime. And like I said, do stay in touch with the committee members if you wanted to follow up with any of these conversations. We've just got a couple of more items of business. I might ask if the guests actually are willing to stay just whilst we quickly clear that up so there's less disruption. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion today? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 2023-2024 Assembly year? And the next meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee will take place on Tuesday, the 28th of November at 10 a.m. in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Hope everyone has a lovely evening. Thank you and goodbye.